The Buffalo crime family, a century in the shadows. This is the story of the Buffalo crime family, known in law enforcement circles as the Arm, a designation that speaks to their role as an extended reach of organized crime's influence across the Canadian border and throughout western New York. Unlike the volatile histories of crime families in larger cities, Buffalo's story moves with the measured pace of the Great Lakes themselves, deep currents of influence flowing beneath a surface that rarely portrays the power structures operating below. Since approximately 1910, this organization has maintained a presence that spans 3 countries, 2 provinces, and 5 generations of leadership. What makes the Buffalo family remarkable is not the drama of its conflicts, but the quiet consistency of its survival. In an era when many similar organizations have fractured, disbanded, or been decimated by prosecutions, Buffalo has endured with a leadership structure so stable that only 5 men have held the position of boss across 115 years. This remarkable continuity began with Giuseppe Joseph Palmieri in the early 1900s, transitioned through Salvatore Sam, De Carlo's brief tenure, and then settled into the long reign of Stefano the Undertaker, Magaddino, whose 40-year leadership would define the family's golden age. The geographic scope of Buffalo's influence tells the story of opportunity and adaptation. Positioned at one of North America's most porous borders, where the Peace Bridge and Rainbow Bridge span the Niagara River, Buffalo became a natural corridor for the movement of goods, people, and influence. During Prohibition, these same bridges that carried legitimate commerce also facilitated one of the most profitable smuggling operations in organized crime history. The family's territory extended north into Hamilton and Toronto, creating what was essentially a binational criminal enterprise operating under the sanction of the American Mafia Commission. Buffalo's story arc follows the broader patterns of 20th century organized crime, but with its own distinctive rhythm. The bootlegging wealth of the 1920s and 1930s established the foundation for decades of influence. The family's elevation to commission status during the 1940s and 1950s marked its recognition as a legitimate power in the national organized crime hierarchy. But it was the dramatic events of 1968, a schism over a discovered cash hoard that would split the family and lead to unprecedented violence, that began Buffalo's transformation from a traditional territorial operation into something more subtle and enduring. The decades that followed saw Buffalo's influence shift from street-level operations to union control, from visible neighborhood presence to behind-the-scenes economic influence. By the 1990s, law enforcement had largely written off the Buffalo family as defunct, a relic of organized crime's more visible past. Yet in 2017, wiretap conversations revealed a truth that would surprise even veteran investigators. The Buffalo family remained active, with approximately 30 made members still operating under the leadership of the Todaro dynasty. This discovery illuminated a fundamental aspect of Buffalo's character, the ability to survive, not through dramatic gestures or headline-grabbing activities, but through patient adaptation and careful discretion. What follows is not a story of glamour or sensational violence, but rather a methodical examination of how one criminal organization has navigated more than a century of social, economic, and legal change. It is a story told through census records and court documents, through the quiet observations of neighbors and the patient work of investigators, through the rise and fall of neighborhoods and the steady flow of the Niagara River that has always defined Buffalo's place in the world. This is the story of the Arm, reaching across borders, across decades, across the changing landscape of organized crime in America. Chapter 1, Foundations, 1910-1922. In the early decades of the 20th century, as America grappled with rapid industrialization and waves of immigration, the city of Buffalo, New York, stood as a gateway between the old world and the new. Positioned strategically along the Great Lakes shipping routes, This bustling industrial center attracted thousands of Italian immigrants seeking opportunity in a land that promised prosperity, but often delivered hardship instead. Among these newcomers were men who carried with them the traditions and codes of their homeland, traditions that would eventually take root in the fertile ground of Prohibition-era America, growing into something both familiar and distinctly American. Around 1908, in the crowded tenements and narrow streets of Buffalo's west side, a Sicilian immigrant named Benedetto Palmieri began establishing what would become the foundation of organized crime in the region. Known to his neighbors as Buffalo Bill, a nickname that spoke to both his adopted city and his larger-than-life personality. Palmieri operated a modest grocery store on Grant Street, serving the growing Italian community that clustered in this part of the city. But Palmieri's ambitions extended far beyond selling olive oil and imported cheeses to homesick immigrants. Drawing upon traditions he had learned in the villages of Sicily, he began organizing what he called protezione, protection services for local merchants who found themselves vulnerable in a city where police protection was often unreliable and language barriers left them isolated. The system Palmieri established was straightforward in its simplicity. Each merchant along his territory would contribute between 10 and 25 cents per week, a modest sum that ensured their businesses would remain safe from vandalism, theft, or other misfortunes that might befall unprotected establishments. For many struggling shopkeepers, this represented a form of insurance they could understand and afford. Between 1910 and 1911, Buffalo's west side experienced a series of violent incidents that would later be viewed as pivotal moments in the emergence of organized crime in the region. 4 murders occurred during this period, each involving Italian immigrants who had, according to neighborhood whispers, refused to cooperate with Palmieri's protection arrangements. These crimes remained officially unsolved, but their message was clear to those who understood the unspoken codes of the old country. During this formative period, Palmieri began organizing what he termed the Umbria Society, ostensibly a cultural organization dedicated to preserving Italian heritage and providing mutual aid to immigrants. In reality, this society served as the organizational framework for his growing influence in the community, providing a legitimate facade for activities that operated according to different rules than those recognized by American law. The Umbria Society held regular meetings in the back room of Palmieri's grocery store, where men would gather to discuss not only matters of community welfare, but also the practical concerns of territorial boundaries, dispute resolution, and the enforcement of their particular code of conduct. These gatherings established patterns of hierarchy and decision-making that would persist for decades to come. In 1912, leadership of this emerging organization passed to Giuseppe De Carlo, a man whose associates referred to him with the respectful title Don Pietro. De Carlo brought with him credentials that extended beyond Buffalo's borders. He had been vouched for by Niccolo Schiro, a powerful boss operating out of New York City, lending legitimacy to his position within the broader network of Italian organized crime families. Under De Carlo's leadership, the loose confederation that Palmieri had established became something more formal and structured. De Carlo instituted a code of silence, omerta, that bound members together in mutual protection and secrecy. He designated specific roles within the organization, appointing an underboss to serve as his second-in-command and a treasurer to manage the growing financial interests of the group. The economic activities overseen by De Carlo expanded beyond simple protection services. In the basement of a butcher shop on Massachusetts Avenue, he established Buffalo's first organized gambling operation, a dice game that attracted players from throughout the Italian community and beyond. The profits from this venture were substantial, but perhaps more importantly, the operation served as a gathering place where information was exchanged and relationships were built. De Carlo also pioneered what would become a signature activity of organized crime families, high-interest lending. Operating from the same butcher shop that housed his gambling operation, He offered loans to fellow immigrants who found themselves unable to secure credit through legitimate banking channels. These meat market loans, as they came to be known, carried interest rates that reflected both the risk involved and the limited alternatives available to borrowers. The enforcement of these financial arrangements required a degree of intimidation that went beyond simple collection efforts. DiCarlo's organization began employing what became known as Black Hand letters, threatening communications that warned of bombings or other violence should payments not be forthcoming. These letters, often adorned with crude drawings of daggers or skulls, created an atmosphere of fear that drove many in the Italian community to seek the protection that DiCarlo's organization offered. The effectiveness of these methods was enhanced by the inability of local law enforcement to penetrate the wall of silence that surrounded DiCarlo's activities. Sergeant Peter Bustos, who served as the Buffalo Police Department's liaison to the Italian community, frequently complained to his superiors that witnesses evaporate whenever investigations touched upon organized crime activities. Detectives working these cases began to notice patterns that suggested a level of organization and discipline that went beyond typical street crime. Multiple killings during this period involved the same type of weapon, .32 caliber nickel-plated revolver, suggesting either a single shooter or a group that had standardized their enforcement methods. This attention to consistency and procedure would become a hallmark of organized crime operations in Buffalo for decades to come. In August of 1921, the trajectory of organized crime in Buffalo was forever altered by the arrival of a 30-year-old Sicilian immigrant named Stefano Magaddino. Unlike the typical economic migrants who had preceded him, Magaddino came to Buffalo as a fugitive, fleeing the consequences of what became known as the Good Killers case in New Jersey. The circumstances of Magaddino's flight from his previous home involved a revenge killing, the murder of Camillo Caiezzo, a man who had apparently wronged Magaddino's family in some fashion that demanded satisfaction according to the codes of Sicilian justice. While the details of this incident remained deliberately obscured, its consequences were clear. Magaddino needed a new home, and Buffalo's Italian community provided the perfect sanctuary. Magaddino was welcomed by Benedetto Palmieri, who recognized in the newcomer a fellow native of Castellammare del Golfo, the Sicilian town that had produced many of America's most influential organized crime leaders. This shared heritage created an immediate bond of trust and understanding that transcended the usual suspicions that greeted strangers in their insular community. Almost immediately upon his arrival, Magaddino demonstrated the qualities that would make him one of the most respected figures in American organized crime. When a bitter feud erupted between members of DiCarlo's organization and workers at a local printing company called Grotto Press, Magaddino stepped forward as a mediator. The dispute involved questions of territory and respect, the kind of conflicts that could easily escalate into violence if not handled with wisdom and authority. Magaddino's resolution of this matter, achieved through patient negotiation and an appeal to shared interests rather than threats or intimidation, earned him a reputation as an impartial judge capable of finding solutions that preserved everyone's dignity. This incident established Magaddino's credentials within Buffalo's organized crime community and demonstrated his understanding of the delicate balance required to maintain order within their world. His approach emphasized consensus building and respect for tradition, qualities that would define his long career in leadership. On July 20, 1922, Don Pietro DiCarlo passed away unexpectedly from a heart ailment, leaving his organization without clear leadership at a critical moment in its development. The transition that followed would establish important precedents for how power was transferred within Buffalo's crime family for generations to come. Rather than allowing the succession to become a source of conflict or division, the senior members of DiCarlo's organization, the Capodicina or crew leaders, gathered in a room above a tavern on Ferry Street to determine their next leader. The meeting was conducted with the formality and deliberation that characterized important decisions within their community. The choice of Stefano Magaddino was unanimous, reflecting both his demonstrated capabilities and the respect he had earned during his brief time in Buffalo. This peaceful transition of power established Buffalo as an organization that would favor quiet competence over flashy displays of violence or wealth. Under Magaddino's leadership, the Buffalo crime family would grow from a loose confederation of neighborhood protection rackets into one of the most stable and long-lasting organized crime families in America. The foundations laid during these early years, the emphasis on tradition, the careful attention to hierarchy and protocol, and the preference for consensus over conflict, would characterize the organization throughout its existence. As 1922 drew to a close, the Buffalo crime family stood poised to enter its golden age, with a leader whose vision and capabilities would guide it through the opportunities and challenges of Prohibition and beyond. The quiet competence that had brought Stefano Magaddino to power would become the hallmark of an organization that preferred to operate in the shadows, building wealth and influence through patience and careful planning, rather than spectacular displays of violence. The stage was now set for the next chapter in this remarkable story of ambition, tradition, and the pursuit of power in industrial America. Chapter 2: Magaddino's Rise, 1922-1933. The year is 1922, and Stefano Magaddino has begun to establish himself as more than just another ambitious immigrant seeking opportunity in Western New York. What follows is a decade that would transform both the man and the criminal landscape of the entire Great Lakes region. In the autumn of 1922, Magaddino made a purchase that would become legendary in the annals of American organized crime. For the modest sum of $8,000, he acquired the Niagara Falls Funeral Chapel at 220 14th Street, a dignified establishment that served the Italian-American community near the Thundering Falls. To most observers, this appeared to be a legitimate business venture, perhaps even a noble calling for a man seeking to serve his community during times of grief. The reality was far more complex. Behind the chapel's velvet curtains and beneath the quiet dignity of its viewing rooms, Magaddino created what federal investigators would later describe as one of the most ingeniously concealed criminal headquarters in the nation. His office occupied a hidden space behind the embalming room, accessible through a concealed door that appeared to be nothing more than a supply closet. Here, surrounded by the tools of his legitimate trade, Magaddino conducted the business that would earn him the moniker, Undertaker. The funeral home provided perfect cover for his activities. Who would question the constant stream of visitors paying their respects? Who would think twice about hushed conversations in corridors designed for mourning? The very nature of the business demanded privacy and discretion, qualities that served Magaddino's expanding criminal enterprises exceptionally well. As the noble experiment of Prohibition took hold across America, Magaddino recognized an unprecedented opportunity. Buffalo's unique geography placed it at the crossroads of one of the most lucrative smuggling routes in North America. Just across the Niagara River lay Ontario, where distilleries operated legally under Canadian law, producing some of the finest whiskey on the continent. Magaddino forged a crucial alliance with Goodham and Warts, one of Ontario's most respected distilling houses. This partnership would prove to be the foundation of his family's wealth for the next decade. Night after night, convoys of Ford Model T trucks made their careful way across the Peace Bridge, their cargo holds filled with cases of premium Canadian whiskey destined for the thirsty speakeasies of Buffalo, Cleveland, and points beyond. The operation was a marvel of logistics and corruption. Magaddino's organization employed more than 30 men who became known as cowboys for their daring border crossings. These men developed an ingenious method for avoiding customs detection along the treacherous Whirlpool Gorge Trail. They would soak horse blankets in alcohol, then wrap them around their bodies beneath heavy coats. To customs agents, they appeared to be nothing more than laborers returning from work in the Canadian mills. The alcohol-soaked blankets not only concealed the scent of contraband whiskey, but also provided warmth during cold winter crossings. The scale of these operations was staggering. By 1926, federal estimates suggested that Magaddino's bootlegging network was generating profits exceeding $1 million annually, an astronomical sum in Depression-era dollars. The Erie Canal's rail sidings became crucial transshipment points, where Canadian whiskey was transferred to rail cars bound for Chicago, where Magaddino had developed profitable relationships with the outfit's leadership. Magaddino's rise during this period cannot be understood without examining his family connections to the broader Sicilian-American criminal network. He was a blood cousin to Giuseppe Joe Bonanno, one of the most influential figures in New York's organized crime hierarchy. This relationship would prove crucial during the tumultuous period known as the Castellamares War, which raged from 1930 to 1931. When violence erupted between the old guard Sicilian leadership and younger, more Americanized criminals, Magaddino provided sanctuary for his cousin Bonanno and other allies. Buffalo's distance from New York's battlegrounds made it an ideal refuge for those seeking to avoid the bloodshed that claimed dozens of lives across the 5 boroughs. The war's conclusion in 1931 marked a watershed moment in American organized crime. The peace summit that ended the conflict established new territorial boundaries and power structures that would endure for decades. Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky's restructuring of the criminal landscape recognized Buffalo's strategic importance by awarding Magaddino's family control over not only western New York, but also southern Ontario and northwestern Pennsylvania. Most significantly, Magaddino was granted one of the 7 original seats on what became known as the Commission, the governing body that would coordinate activities between America's major crime families. This recognition placed him among the most powerful criminal leaders in the nation, a remarkable achievement for a man who had arrived in America with little more than his ambition and his family connections. Despite his growing power and wealth, Magaddino cultivated an image of modest respectability that served him well in Buffalo's close-knit Italian-American community. He chose to live in a simple ranch-style home in nearby Lewiston, eschewing the ostentatious displays of wealth that characterized some of his contemporaries. He drove his own Buick sedan rather than employing a chauffeur, and notably declined the protection of bodyguards when attending Mass at his local parish. This carefully crafted image of humility extended to his community involvement. Church records from the period show that Magaddino made an anonymous donation of $1,000 to repair the roof of St. Joseph's Parish in 1928. The parish priest, unaware of his benefactor's true identity, publicly praised this humble benefactor who seeks no recognition for his Christian generosity. Such gestures were not mere public relations exercises, but reflected Magaddino's understanding that community support was essential for long-term survival. Unlike criminal leaders who ruled through fear and intimidation, Magaddino sought to position himself as a protector and benefactor of his community. This approach created a network of loyalty and silence that would prove invaluable in the years to come. As the 1920s drew to a close, Magaddino demonstrated the strategic thinking that would characterize his long career. He recognized that Prohibition would not last forever and began positioning his organization for the inevitable changes ahead. The family's enormous bootlegging profits were carefully invested in legitimate businesses and new criminal enterprises that would survive the end of the noble experiment. Horse race betting rooms began appearing throughout Buffalo and its suburbs, staffed by Magaddino associates and protected by carefully cultivated relationships with local law enforcement. These establishments would provide steady income streams independent of the whiskey trade. Simultaneously, the family began the patient work of infiltrating labor unions, recognizing that the post-Prohibition era would offer new opportunities in the expanding industrial economy of Western New York. The groundwork laid during these years would prove prophetic. When Prohibition finally ended in 1933, many criminal organizations found themselves without their primary source of income. Magaddino's family, however, seamlessly transitioned to new enterprises, their financial foundation secure and their territorial control unchallenged. As we close this chapter of our examination of the Buffalo crime family, it's important to recognize that the years from 1922 to 1933 established patterns that would define organized crime in Western New York for decades to come. Magaddino's combination of strategic thinking, family loyalty, and community integration created an organization that was both powerful and remarkably durable. The funeral home on 14th Street continued to serve as the family's headquarters well into the 1960s, its velvet curtains concealing secrets that law enforcement would spend decades trying to uncover. The relationships forged during the Prohibition era with Canadian suppliers, Chicago customers, and local officials would prove to be lasting assets in the family's criminal portfolio. Most significantly, Magaddino's elevation to the commission established Buffalo as a permanent player in the national organized crime hierarchy. No longer was this a regional criminal organization operating in the shadow of New York or Chicago families. Buffalo had earned its place at the table where America's most important criminal decisions were made. As the calendar turned to 1934 and America began to emerge from the depths of the Great Depression, Stefano Magaddino stood at the pinnacle of his power. Chapter 3: Cross-Border Golden Age, 1934–1956. The mid-1930s brought an unexpected transformation to Buffalo's underworld, as Stefano Magaddino's organization evolved from a collection of neighborhood crews into something resembling a legitimate civic institution. This period, spanning from 1934 to 1956, would become known as the family's Golden Age, a time when the line between organized crime and community leadership blurred in ways that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. At the center of this transformation stood a man whose very existence challenged every stereotype about organized crime figures. Montana, Magaddino's newly appointed underboss, represented something entirely new in the American underworld. A crime family lieutenant who could command respect in both the boardroom and the backroom with equal authority. Montana's rise began with his acquisition of the Milk Producers Cooperative in 1934, a legitimate business that would serve as both his public face and private fortress for the next 2 decades. The cooperative, housed in a modest brick building on Seneca Street, processed dairy products from farms throughout western New York. Montana transformed it into one of the region's most successful agricultural enterprises, employing over 200 workers and maintaining contracts with every major grocery chain in the Buffalo area. What made Montana truly remarkable, however, was his parallel career in public service. In 1935, just 1 year after taking control of the cooperative, he successfully ran for Buffalo City Council as an alderman representing the West Side's Italian neighborhoods. His campaign emphasized honest government, improved city services, and support for working families themes that resonated deeply with voters who had grown cynical about political corruption. Montana's political ascent continued in 1940 when his fellow council members elected him council president, making him one of the most powerful figures in Buffalo's municipal government. By day, he presided over council meetings with parliamentary precision, delivered speeches at Rotary Club luncheons about civic responsibility, and appeared at ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new schools and hospitals. His office walls displayed certificates of appreciation from the Chamber of Commerce, photographs with visiting dignitaries, and civic awards recognizing his contributions to the community. Yet, as evening shadows fell across Buffalo, Montana would drive his black Cadillac to his stately mansion on Elmwood Avenue, where a very different kind of meeting would take place. In the mansion's oak-paneled study, Caparagimes from across western New York would gather to discuss territory disputes, settle grievances between crews, and coordinate the family's expanding operations. The same man who had spent his afternoon debating municipal budgets would now arbitrate questions of tribute payments and territorial boundaries with equal authority. The local press, charmed by Montana's public persona and unaware of his evening activities, dubbed him Mr. Scott Clean. a nickname that would prove both prophetic and ironic as federal investigators eventually turned their attention to Buffalo's unusually civic-minded crime family. Montana's dual existence reflected the broader evolution of Magaddino's organization during these years. The family had learned to operate with a sophistication that set it apart from its more volatile counterparts in New York and Chicago. Violence, while never completely abandoned, became a tool of last resort rather than first response. The emphasis shifted toward generating steady, reliable income streams that could operate in plain sight without attracting unwanted attention. Nowhere was this approach more evident than in the family's gambling operations, which reached unprecedented heights during the 1940s. The nerve center of this empire was a seemingly ordinary office building on Hertel Avenue, where what appeared to be a small accounting firm actually housed the most sophisticated race wire operation in the Northeast. The Hertel Avenue operation processed an astounding 25,000 bets daily at its peak in the late 1940s, generating gross revenues approaching $20 million annually. The system worked with clockwork precision. Results from racetracks across the country arrived via telegraph, were immediately processed by a team of clerks, and were distributed to hundreds of bookmakers throughout the region within minutes of each race's conclusion. The operation's success stemmed from its integration with legitimate businesses throughout Buffalo. Barbershops, corner stores, and small restaurants served as betting parlors, with owners receiving a percentage of the take in exchange for providing a front for the operation. The system was so deeply embedded in the community's daily life that many residents viewed it as simply another municipal service, like garbage collection or street cleaning. Running parallel to the race wire was an equally impressive numbers racket overseen by Daniel Boots Sansasane, a soft-spoken mathematics professor turned gambling coordinator. Sansasane had developed an ingenious distribution system using legitimate bakery trucks to move policy slips throughout the city. Each morning, drivers would load their trucks with fresh bread and pastries, along with carefully concealed bundles of betting slips. As they made their regular deliveries to restaurants and stores, they would quietly collect the previous day's bets and distribute new numbers for that day's drawing. The numbers game had become so popular in Buffalo's working-class neighborhoods that it functioned almost like an informal banking system. Workers would place small daily bets, often just nickels or dimes, with the hope of hitting a number that would pay off at 600 to 1 odds. For many families struggling through the Depression and its aftermath, the daily number represented their only realistic chance at financial advancement. While gambling provided the family's most visible revenue stream, perhaps its most strategic investment was the infiltration of organized labor. In the early 1940s, Magaddino had backed Joe Todaro Sr., a young enforcer with natural leadership abilities, for a position within laborers' local 2000. Todaro's rise through the union hierarchy was swift and systematic, aided by the mysterious departures of several rivals who decided to pursue opportunities in other cities. By 1950, every business agent in Local 210 required Magaddino's approval before taking office. The family had effectively transformed one of Buffalo's most powerful unions into a private employment agency, capable of shutting down construction projects throughout western New York with a simple phone call. The financial arrangements were elegantly simple. Construction companies seeking labor peace agreed to return 2% of each contract's value in cash payments, delivered monthly to designated collection points throughout the city. Additionally, the union's pension fund invested heavily in concrete and construction supply companies owned by family associates, creating a closed loop that generated profits at every level. The union also served another crucial function, providing legitimate employment for family soldiers who needed to demonstrate legal income sources. 25 men carried union cards and drew regular paychecks for jobs that required their presence only when actual union business needed attention. For tax purposes, they were hard-working construction laborers. In reality, they were full-time members of Magaddino's organization. As the 1940s progressed, the family's operations expanded beyond Buffalo's borders in increasingly sophisticated ways. The end of World War II had created new opportunities in narcotics trafficking, as returning veterans and urban populations developed appetites for substances that had been largely unknown before the conflict. The Canadian connection, which had been so profitable during Prohibition, evolved to meet this new demand. Beginning in 1947, Buffalo couriers began making regular trips to Montreal, where they would collect morphine base from suppliers connected to the French Connection network. The raw material would return to Buffalo hidden in Canadian National Railway fish crates, taking advantage of minimal customs inspection of the rail yards. Small laboratories near Lockport, housed in what appeared to be agricultural buildings, would refine the morphine base into heroin for distribution throughout the Northeast. The operation's success depended on maintaining the appearance of legitimate cross-border commerce, with paperwork showing routine shipments of Canadian fish to Buffalo restaurants and markets. The low seizure rate federal agents intercepted less than 5% of the shipments, reflected both the operation's careful planning and the limited resources available to drug enforcement agencies in the immediate post-war period. The Food and Drug Administration maintained only a skeleton crew at the Buffalo rail yard, and their primary concerns involved food safety rather than narcotics interdiction. Throughout this period of expansion and prosperity, Magaddino maintained his reputation as a stabilizing force in Buffalo's Italian neighborhoods. The murder rate among Italian Americans dropped to its lowest levels since the 1920s, a development that residents openly credited to Uncle Steve's influence. Disputes that might have escalated to violence in other cities were resolved through arbitration sessions in Magaddino's Niagara Falls home, where the Don would listen patiently to all sides before rendering decisions that were accepted without question. This reputation for fairness and order extended beyond the criminal underworld into the broader community. Magaddino became a generous patron of local Italian-American organizations, financing the annual Italian Festival's band stage and contributing to the construction of new church facilities. Local newspapers, when they mentioned him at all, described him as a quiet, devout Catholic businessman who preferred to avoid publicity. The family's community involvement reached its peak during the immediate post-war years, when returning veterans found steady employment in family-connected businesses and unions. For many young Italian-American men, Magaddino's organization provided opportunities for advancement that were largely unavailable in mainstream Buffalo society, which remained dominated by established Protestant families. Yet even as the family enjoyed unprecedented prosperity and community acceptance, subtle changes were beginning to reshape the landscape of American law enforcement. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under J. Edgar Hoover's direction, had begun developing new techniques for investigating organized crime. Wiretapping technology was improving, and a new generation of federal prosecutors was taking office with different priorities than their predecessors. In Washington, politicians were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about cities like Buffalo, where organized crime families appeared to operate with impunity. Senate committees were forming to investigate labor racketeering and interstate gambling operations. The Internal Revenue Service was developing new methods for detecting unreported income and following money trails across state lines. Most ominously for Magaddino and his associates, federal agents were beginning to map the connections between crime families in different cities, recognizing that what had previously been viewed as local problems were actually components of a national criminal network. The isolation that had protected Buffalo's family for so long was slowly dissolving as law enforcement agencies learned to share information and coordinate investigations across jurisdictional boundaries. As 1956 drew to a close, Stefano Magaddino could look back on more than 2 decades of remarkable success. His organization had evolved from a collection of neighborhood gangs into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated millions in annual revenue while maintaining the respect of the broader community. The family had weathered the end of Prohibition, adapted to changing economic conditions, and established itself as a permanent fixture in Western New York's social and economic landscape. Yet beneath the surface, calm, federal interest was growing in ways that would soon transform the American understanding of organized crime forever, setting the stage for revelations that would expose the true scope and nature of families like Magaddino's to unprecedented public scrutiny. Chapter 4. Apalachin Shock, 1957. The morning of November 14, 1957, dawned crisp and clear across the rolling hills of upstate New York. In the small hamlet of Apalachin, nestled in the southern tier near the Pennsylvania border, Joseph Joe the Barber prepared his modest farmhouse for what would become the most infamous gathering in organized crime history. Barbara, a longtime associate of the Buffalo family and trusted mediator among the Eastern families, had no idea that his hospitality would soon expose the very existence of La Cosa Nostra to the American public. The meeting had been called to address pressing family business. Recent upheavals in New York, including the attempted assassination of Frank Costello and the mysterious disappearance of Albert Anastasia just weeks earlier, had created uncertainty throughout the commission structure. Stefano Magaddino, as the senior don among the northeastern families, felt the need for a face-to-face gathering to restore order and clarify territorial boundaries. As the sun climbed higher that Thursday morning, an unprecedented parade of luxury automobiles began winding through the quiet country roads toward Barbara's property. 62 Cadillacs and Packards, their chrome gleaming in the autumn light, carried the most powerful crime figures from across the eastern seaboard. The vehicles bore license plates from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and California, creating a procession that would have impressed any funeral director or political convention organizer. Among the distinguished passengers were Vito Genovese, recently ascendant in the New York hierarchy, Joey Gallo from Brooklyn, the feared narcotics trafficker Carmine Galante, and dozens of other capos, underbosses, and family representatives. From Buffalo came John Montana, the respected businessman whose civic involvement had made him one of the most publicly visible members of the Magaddino organization, though few knew of his true affiliations. The gathering might have proceeded without incident, just another in a long series of discreet meetings that had shaped organized crime policy for decades. However, fate intervened in the form of New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell, a methodical investigator who had been quietly monitoring Barbara's activities for months. Croswell had noticed the unusual collection of out-of-state license plates and expensive automobiles converging on the remote farmhouse, and his law enforcement instincts told him something significant was occurring. Working with fellow trooper Vincent Basisco, Croswell established a roadblock at the only practical exit from the Barbara property. Their plan was simple: identify and question the visitors to determine the nature of the gathering. Neither officer could have anticipated the dramatic scene that would unfold when word of the police presence reached the farmhouse. Inside Barbara's home, the assembled crime leaders had been conducting their business with the usual formality and respect for protocol. Territorial disputes were being mediated, family successions were being recognized, and the complex web of relationships that bound the families together was being rewoven after recent disruptions. The atmosphere was businesslike but cordial, with the kind of mutual respect that characterized interactions among men who understood the importance of honor and tradition. The announcement that state police had established a roadblock created immediate pandemonium. Men who had spent their entire adult lives avoiding law enforcement attention suddenly found themselves trapped on a remote farm with no discreet means of escape. The carefully orchestrated meeting dissolved into chaos as dozens of expensively dressed figures abandoned their dignity and fled into the surrounding woods. The sight that greeted Sergeant Croswell and his fellow officers was both comical and revealing. Men in $1,000 silk suits and handmade Italian shoes stumbled through brambles and undergrowth, their usual composure replaced by desperate attempts to avoid identification. Some discarded jewelry and personal items in their haste to escape, while others simply surrendered to the inevitable and allowed themselves to be detained for questioning. Among those apprehended was John Montana, whose explanation for his presence would become legendary in law enforcement circles. When questioned about his business at the Barbara farm, Montana calmly stated that he had been walking the dog and had simply stopped by to visit his old friend Joe Barbara. The fact that no dog was ever located, and that Montana lived hundreds of miles away, made his explanation somewhat less than convincing to the investigating officers. The Apalachin incident created immediate repercussions throughout the organized crime world. For the first time, law enforcement had documented proof that a national crime syndicate existed, complete with formal meetings and coordinated leadership. The names and faces captured that day provided federal investigators with a roadmap of organized crime hierarchy that had previously existed only in theory and rumor. John Montana faced the most immediate legal consequences among the Buffalo representatives. Federal prosecutors charged him with perjury for his testimony regarding the meeting, arguing that his walking the dog explanation constituted deliberate deception under oath. Though the conviction was later overturned on appeal, the damage to Montana's carefully constructed public image was irreversible. The exposure forced Montana to resign from his numerous civic positions, including his role on the Buffalo City Planning Commission and his membership in various charitable organizations. His reputation as a successful, legitimate businessman was forever tainted by his association with the Apalachin Gathering, effectively ending his ability to serve as a public front for family interests. Stefano Magaddino, characteristically, had managed to avoid the police dragnet entirely. Whether through advance warning, careful planning, or simple good fortune, the Buffalo Don was not among those detained or identified at the scene. This successful evasion only enhanced his reputation for cunning and careful preparation, reinforcing his status among family members as a leader who could navigate dangerous situations while protecting the organization's interests. However, the federal response to Apalachin would prove far more challenging than any immediate arrests. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, previously skeptical of organized crime's existence as a national phenomenon, launched the Top Hoodlum program to investigate the family systematically. The Buffalo field office saw its complement of agents investigating organized crime triple virtually overnight, beginning a new era of sustained federal attention that would fundamentally alter the landscape for all the families. The quiet meeting in Apalachin had ended, but its consequences would echo through the halls of power for decades to come. Chapter 5: Pressure and Paranoia, 1958 to 1967. As the 1950s drew to a close, Stefano Magaddino's carefully constructed empire began to show the first hairline cracks that would eventually threaten its very foundation. The man who had ruled Buffalo's underworld for nearly 4 decades now found himself facing pressures from multiple directions. Federal investigators armed with new technology, ambitious subordinates questioning his leadership, and a changing world that seemed increasingly hostile to the old ways of doing business. The most insidious threat came not from rival families or street-level competitors, but from an invisible enemy that listened to every whispered conversation and recorded every careless word. In the spring of 1958, federal agents achieved what decades of investigation and surveillance had failed to accomplish. They found a way inside the inner sanctum of the Magaddino organization itself. The breakthrough came through an unlikely source: the Magaddino Memorial Chapel on Niagara Street, the legitimate funeral parlor that served as both the family's public face and, unknowingly, its most vulnerable point. FBI technicians, working under cover of darkness and with meticulous planning, managed to install sophisticated recording equipment in the very heart of the building. A tiny microphone no larger than a button was embedded in the ceiling directly above the embalming table, where Stefano Magaddino often conducted his most sensitive business meetings. The choice of location was both practical and symbolic. Who would suspect that conversations about territorial disputes, tribute collections, and family discipline would be overheard in a place dedicated to honoring the dead? The irony was not lost on the federal agents who monitored the recordings. In their pursuit of the living criminals, they had turned a house of mourning into a house of evidence. For nearly a decade, that hidden microphone would capture an extraordinary archive of organized crime operations. By 1968, the surveillance had produced over 76,000 pages of transcribed conversations, creating the most comprehensive record of Mafia activities ever compiled by law enforcement. The recordings revealed not just the mechanics of criminal enterprise, but the personalities, relationships, and internal tensions that drove one of America's most secretive organizations. Among the most revealing recordings was a conversation from late 1959, when Magaddino was heard chastising a soldier who had apparently been skimming from gambling proceeds. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he delivered what amounted to a philosophical lesson in criminal loyalty: the arm that feeds must not be bitten. The phrase would become legendary among federal investigators, encapsulating the code of absolute obedience that held the organization together. But even as the FBI gathered its evidence in secret, visible cracks began appearing in Magaddino's carefully maintained hierarchy. The arrest and subsequent incarceration of underboss Freddie Lupo Randaccio in 1962 on extortion charges created a power vacuum that would prove difficult to fill. Randaccio had been more than just Magaddino's second-in-command. He had been a trusted confidant who understood the delicate balance required to manage the family's diverse criminal enterprises while maintaining discipline among the ranks. With Randaccio behind bars, Magaddino faced a dilemma that would test his political instincts. The position of underboss was traditionally filled through careful consultation and consensus building, ensuring that the chosen successor commanded respect throughout the organization. However, the external pressures of federal investigation and internal challenges to his authority left little time for such deliberative processes. In a decision that would prove both controversial and revealing, Magaddino chose to elevate his own son, Peter Magaddino, to serve as acting underboss. The appointment represented a break from traditional Mafia protocol, which generally discouraged nepotism in favor of merit-based advancement. While Peter possessed intelligence and ambition, his rapid elevation over more seasoned members of the organization created resentment among those who felt they had earned the right to advancement through years of loyal service. Peter Magaddino's tenure as acting underboss was marked by a management style that differed dramatically from the patient, consensus-building approach that had characterized his father's long reign. Where Stefano Magaddino had ruled through a combination of respect, fear, and careful attention to the concerns of his subordinates, Peter displayed what many considered an imperious attitude that bordered on arrogance. His youth and relative inexperience in the subtle arts of criminal diplomacy became apparent in his dealings with capos and soldiers who had been operating in the organization since before his birth. The criticism of Peter's leadership style was not merely a matter of wounded pride or generational conflict. In an organization where respect and loyalty were the fundamental currencies of power, any perceived slight or display of disrespect could have far-reaching consequences. Soldiers who felt marginalized or disrespected might begin to question not just the acting underboss, but the judgment of the Don who had appointed him. Meanwhile, the external pressures on the Magaddino organization continued to intensify. The year 1965 brought a new and particularly damaging form of scrutiny when the Italian government's Anti-Mafia Commission published a report that named Stefano Magaddino as a key figure in international heroin trafficking. The Commission's findings, based on investigations into the Sicilian Mafia's American connections, painted Magaddino not as a local crime boss, but as a crucial link in a global narcotics network. The timing of the Italian report could not have been worse for Magaddino's carefully cultivated public image. For decades, he had successfully portrayed himself as a legitimate businessman whose funeral parlor and other enterprises served the Buffalo community. Local newspapers had generally treated him with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. acknowledging rumors about his criminal activities while noting his contributions to Italian-American cultural organizations and charitable causes. The Anti-Mafia Commission's allegations changed that narrative dramatically. When the New York Times and other major publications picked up the story, Magaddino found himself described not as a local tough guy or even a regional crime boss, but as an international narcotics kingpin. The transformation from neighborhood don to global criminal was both swift and devastating to his reputation. Suddenly, the man who had once been seen as a product of Buffalo's rough immigrant neighborhoods was portrayed as a sophisticated criminal mastermind with connections spanning continents. The shift in public perception was more than just an embarrassment. It represented a fundamental threat to the organization's operational security. The old model of organized crime had relied heavily on community tolerance and official indifference. Local police might look the other way at gambling operations or even minor acts of violence, but international drug trafficking carried implications that extended far beyond local jurisdictions. Federal agencies that might have been content to monitor traditional mafia activities became intensely interested in any organization linked to global narcotics networks. As external pressures mounted, internal dissent within the Magaddino organization began to surface more openly. The combination of increased law enforcement attention, leadership questions surrounding Peter Magaddino's role, and the natural tensions that arose from decades of centralized control created an environment where previously unthinkable challenges to authority began to emerge. Among the most vocal critics were Sam Johns Pieri and Joseph Fino, two soldiers whose complaints reflected broader frustrations within the organization. Both men had served the family loyally for years, managing gambling operations and collecting tribute from various enterprises throughout the Buffalo area. However, as law enforcement pressure increased and profits became harder to generate, they began to question the traditional distribution of earnings that had long favored the upper levels of the hierarchy. Their grievances centered on what they saw as an increasingly unfair division of profits. While they faced the daily risks of arrest and prosecution, handling the street-level operations that generated the family's income, they received what they considered a disproportionately small share of the proceeds. The traditional percentage system, which had worked effectively when operations faced little scrutiny and profits were substantial, began to seem exploitative when every transaction carried the risk of federal surveillance. By 1966, Pieri and Fino had moved beyond private complaints to more direct action. They began withholding portions of the gambling tribute they collected, arguing that the money was needed to support their own operations and families. This represented a fundamental challenge to the organizational structure that had maintained order within the family for decades. The tribute system was not merely a method of profit distribution, it was a symbol of respect and acknowledgement of hierarchical authority. Federal surveillance captured the growing tensions in a series of recorded conversations that revealed the depth of the organizational crisis. An FBI informant's memo from late 1966 quoted Joseph Fino's blunt assessment of the situation. "The old man socks away sacks while we get pennies." The language was crude, but it captured the essence of a growing rebellion that threatened to tear apart the careful balance of power that Stefano Magaddino had spent 40 years constructing. The rebellion of Pieri and Fino was particularly dangerous because it reflected broader economic and social changes that were affecting organized crime throughout the country. The traditional neighborhood-based operations that had sustained mafia families for generations were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Urban renewal projects displaced established communities. Federal legislation made certain forms of gambling more difficult to operate, and changing social attitudes reduced the tolerance for organized crime activities that had once been overlooked. At the same time, the very success of the Magaddino organization created new challenges. The wealth and power that Stefano Magaddino had accumulated over the decades made him an increasingly attractive target for federal investigators. The funeral parlor that had once provided perfect cover for criminal meetings now served as a focal point for surveillance operations. The legitimate businesses that had laundered illegal profits now drew scrutiny from tax investigators and regulatory agencies. As 1967 approached, Stefano Magaddino found himself in a position that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. The man who had once commanded absolute loyalty and respect now faced open rebellion from his own soldiers, intense scrutiny from federal investigators, and a public image that had been transformed from local tough guy to international criminal mastermind. The empire he had built through patience, violence, and political cunning was showing signs of strain that would only intensify in the turbulent years ahead. The recordings from the funeral parlor microphone continued to capture the daily operations of a criminal organization under siege, creating an audio diary of decline that would eventually provide prosecutors with the evidence they needed to dismantle one of America's most enduring crime families. But in 1967, that final reckoning still lay in the future, as Stefano Magaddino struggled to maintain control over an organization that was slowly but inexorably slipping from his grasp. Chapter 6. Cash Stash Betrayal, 1968-1973. The late 1960s brought unexpected scrutiny to the Magaddino family as federal attention intensified following years of careful observation. What had been a period of relative stability under Stefano Magaddino's leadership would soon face challenges both from law enforcement raids and internal family disputes over money and territory. September 20th, 1968, marked a turning point for the Buffalo organization. On this crisp autumn morning, a joint task force of New York State Police and FBI agents descended upon the modest two-story home of Peter Magaddino in Lewiston, New York. Peter, a cousin of the aging Don Stefano, had maintained what appeared to be an unremarkable residence in this quiet Niagara County community, just a few miles from the thundering falls that drew tourists from around the world. The raid had been months in planning. Federal agents had been tracking financial irregularities and suspicious activity patterns that led them to believe significant assets might be hidden within the Magaddino network. What they discovered in Peter's attic exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. Carefully concealed within what appeared to be ordinary wedding cake boxes, investigators uncovered $521,000 in cash. The bills were meticulously organized and wrapped, suggesting this was not merely a temporary hiding place, but rather a sophisticated storage system that had been in operation for some time. The money represented an enormous sum for the era, equivalent to several $1 million in today's currency. The discovery extended beyond just currency. Among the hidden items, agents found uncashed United States Treasury bonds, their serial numbers carefully documented for later investigation. Perhaps most unusually, they also uncovered a World War II-era flamethrower, its purpose in a suburban attic remaining a matter of speculation for investigators. The Buffalo News captured the public's fascination with their headline the following morning, "Mob Millions Found in Mobster's Loft." The story dominated local news coverage and brought unwanted attention to the Magaddino family's financial operations. For an organization that had prided itself on maintaining a low profile, the discovery represented a significant breach of their carefully constructed secrecy. Peter Magaddino's arrest sent ripples throughout western New York's underworld. The substantial cash discovery raised immediate questions about the family's revenue streams and storage methods. Federal prosecutors began building cases around tax evasion and unreported income, while other family members worried about what additional raids might uncover. As if the federal attention wasn't challenging enough, the Magaddino family found itself confronting internal disagreements that had been simmering beneath the surface for several years. These disputes centered primarily around financial arrangements and the distribution of proceeds from various family enterprises. One of the most contentious issues involved the traditional street tax that had been collected from independent operators working within family territory. This weekly tribute had long been a cornerstone of the organization's revenue structure, ensuring that all criminal activity within their geographical boundaries contributed to the family's treasury. Younger members, particularly those who had established successful independent operations, felt constrained by traditional tribute requirements. They argued that changing times and increased law enforcement pressure required more flexible financial arrangements. The disputes gradually crystallized into two distinct factions within the organization. The Loyalist group, which included established figures like the Randaccio brothers and members of the Nicoletti crew, supported maintaining traditional tribute systems and centralized financial control. They viewed these arrangements as essential to family unity and discipline. The opposing faction, which came to be known as the Rebels, included influential figures such as the Pieri brothers, Joe Fino, and Daniel Sansasane. These men advocated for greater financial independence for individual crews and a reduction in traditional tribute requirements. They argued that the family's survival in an increasingly challenging environment required adaptation of long-standing practices. By December of 1970, the internal disputes had reached a level that threatened the family's operational effectiveness. Revenue streams were being disrupted as different factions pursued conflicting policies. The situation had become serious enough to attract attention from the Commission, the governing body that oversaw territorial and organizational disputes among the major crime families. The Commission's intervention reflected both the importance of the Buffalo Territory and concern about the precedent that might be set if internal disputes were allowed to escalate unchecked. New York's major family bosses recognized that prolonged conflict within the Magaddino organization could disrupt established territorial arrangements and revenue streams that extended well beyond western New York. After careful deliberation, the Commission appointed Salvatore Frangiamore as interim boss to oversee the Buffalo Territory during this period of transition. Frangiamore, known by the nickname Sam the Farmer, brought both experience and a reputation for practical problem-solving to his new role. His agricultural background had given him extensive connections throughout rural western New York, while his involvement in family operations had demonstrated his ability to manage complex financial arrangements. The appointment of an interim leader represented a temporary solution designed to protect revenue streams while allowing time for internal disputes to be resolved. Frangiamore's mandate focused particularly on maintaining the family's various business interests and ensuring that territorial control remained intact during this period of uncertainty. Sam the Farmer's approach emphasized pragmatic solutions over rigid adherence to traditional practices. He worked to establish compromise arrangements that addressed some rebel concerns while maintaining essential organizational discipline. His goal was to preserve family unity without completely abandoning the financial structures that had sustained the organization for decades. Despite the Commission's intervention and Frangiamore's mediation efforts, tensions within the family continued to simmer throughout the early 1970s. The underlying disagreements about financial arrangements and operational autonomy had not been fully resolved, and various incidents suggested that some members remained deeply dissatisfied with existing arrangements. In 1971, a barn explosion in Aurora, New York, drew attention from both law enforcement and family members who suspected internal sabotage. While no one was injured in the incident, the timing and location suggested possible connections to ongoing family disputes. The barn belonged to associates of one of the rebel faction members, leading to speculation about whether this represented retaliation or intimidation. The following year brought additional incidents that seemed designed to send messages rather than cause serious harm. A fruit market fire in Buffalo's east side destroyed property, but occurred during hours when the building was unoccupied. Investigators found evidence suggesting arson, though no arrests were made. The market's ownership had connections to one of the families involved in the ongoing factional disputes. Perhaps most significantly, the Pieri family farmhouse in rural Erie County experienced a series of intimidating incidents during 1972 and 73. These included damaged farm equipment, threatening messages, and suspicious individuals observed surveilling the property. While no family members were physically harmed, the pattern of harassment suggested systematic pressure designed to influence the Pieri brothers' positions in ongoing negotiations. The incidents shared several characteristics that reflected the family's traditional approach to internal discipline. Violence, when it occurred, was carefully controlled and designed to send specific messages rather than cause widespread destruction. Civilian safety was consistently protected, with incidents timed and planned to avoid innocent casualties. This restrained approach reflected both practical considerations and traditional family codes. Excessive violence would have attracted unwanted law enforcement attention at a time when the organization was already facing increased scrutiny. Additionally, the family's long-standing presence in Western New York communities required maintaining relationships with legitimate businesses and residents who might be affected by more aggressive tactics. As 1973 progressed, it became clear that the Magaddino family faced challenges that extended well beyond the immediate factional disputes. The combination of federal pressure, internal disagreements, and generational changes within the organization suggested that significant adaptations would be necessary for long-term survival. The cash discovery in Peter Magaddino's attic had exposed vulnerabilities in the family's financial operations, while ongoing internal disputes revealed deeper questions about organizational structure and leadership succession. San the farmer's interim leadership provided stability, but the underlying tensions that had created this crisis remained largely unresolved. These years of cash stash betrayal and internal conflict would prove to be a crucial transition period for the Buffalo organization, setting the stage for even more significant changes in the years ahead. Chapter 7, 1974, Flashpoint. The spring of 1974 brought with it an unseasonable chill to Buffalo's west side, where the old neighborhood dynamics that had held for decades were beginning to fracture along lines that few could have predicted. The Italian-American social clubs that dotted Niagara Street maintained their usual rhythms, elderly men gathering for card games, younger associates conducting quiet conversations over espresso. But beneath this familiar surface, tensions that had been building for months were approaching a dangerous crescendo. John Camilleri had spent most of April preparing for what should have been a celebration. As a respected capo in the Magaddino organization, the 62-year-old had earned his position through decades of steady service and careful management of his crew's activities along the Buffalo waterfront. His upcoming birthday represented not just another year of life, but another year of successful navigation through the increasingly complex world of organized crime in Western New York. The Casa di Pizza restaurant on Hertel Avenue had long served as an informal meeting place for members of Buffalo's Italian-American community. Its owner, a hard-working immigrant from Sicily, had created an atmosphere that reminded his customers of the old country-checkered tablecloths, the aroma of garlic and oregano, walls decorated with photographs of Mount Etna and the Mediterranean coastline. For Camilleri, it represented a piece of the world his father had described in stories told during his childhood. On the evening of May 8, 1974, Camilleri arrived at Casa di Pizza for what he believed would be a quiet birthday dinner with close associates. The restaurant's familiar warmth welcomed him as he took his usual table near the back, positioned to provide a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen. This careful positioning reflected habits developed over years of understanding that in his line of work, awareness of one's surroundings could mean the difference between life and death. The two men who entered the restaurant at approximately 8:15 that evening appeared unremarkable to the other diners. Dressed in dark suits appropriate for an evening out, they moved with the casual confidence of regular customers. However, their purpose became immediately clear as they approached Camilleri's table with .38 caliber revolvers drawn from beneath their jackets. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, the sound echoing off the restaurant's tile floors and plaster walls. John Camilleri fell forward onto his birthday dinner, his 63rd year of life ending exactly as it had begun, in violence and uncertainty. The gunmen departed as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind a scene that will be analyzed and discussed by law enforcement officials for months to come. The other diners, traumatized by what they had witnessed, provided varying accounts of the incident, though all agreed on the professional manner in which the assassination had been carried out. Buffalo police detectives arriving at the scene found themselves confronting a crime that bore all the hallmarks of an internal organizational dispute. The precision of the attack, the choice of location, and the timing all suggested that Camilleri's death represented more than a simple elimination of a rival. Initial investigations revealed that the fallen capo had remained steadfastly loyal to Don Stefano Magaddino during a period when other family members had begun to question the aging boss's leadership decisions. The police speculation centered on the possibility that a rebel faction within the Buffalo organization had decided to remove Magaddino loyalists as part of a broader power struggle. This theory gained credibility as investigators examined recent changes in the family's operational structure and noted increasing tensions between different crews operating in various parts of western New York. The fear among law enforcement officials was that Camilleri's assassination might represent the opening move in a full-scale internal war. As spring turned to summer, the Buffalo organization found itself operating under a cloud of uncertainty that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the Camilleri hit. The investigation into his death had brought increased police attention to family activities throughout the region, while internal discussions about leadership and direction grew more heated with each passing week. For Don Stefano Magaddino, now in his 82nd year, the challenges of maintaining control over an increasingly fractious organization were taking a visible toll on his health. The heat of July 1974 proved particularly oppressive in western New York, with temperatures climbing into the 90s and humidity levels that made even simple activities exhausting for elderly residents. For Magaddino, whose robust constitution had carried him through more than 5 decades of leadership in organized crime, the combination of physical stress and organizational pressures created a burden that his aging body could no longer bear. On July 19, 1974, Don Stefano Magaddino suffered a massive heart attack while at his home in Lewiston, New York. Emergency medical personnel transported him to Mount St. Mary's Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize his condition. However, the damage to his heart proved too extensive. One of the longest-serving bosses in the history of American organized crime drew his final breath. The news of Magaddino's death spread quickly through both the legitimate and illegitimate communities of western New York. For many Italian Americans in Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and surrounding areas, the Don had represented a connection to the old country and its traditions, even if they disagreed with his methods. For law enforcement officials, his passing marked the end of an era characterized by a particular style of leadership that had shaped organized crime activities in the region for generations. The funeral arrangements for Don Stefano reflected both his status within the criminal underworld and his family's desire to honor their patriarch with dignity. 50 black sedans formed the funeral procession that wound through the streets of Niagara Falls and Buffalo, carrying mourners who represented every level of the organization he had led for so many years. The sight of this procession, moving slowly through neighborhoods where Magaddino's influence had been felt for decades, provided a stark visual reminder of the power structure that was now facing fundamental change. FBI agents and local police photographers documented the funeral proceedings with particular attention to identifying attendees who might provide insights into the family's current membership and hierarchy. The presence of family members from other cities, including Detroit, Rochester, and Toronto, suggested that Magaddino's influence had extended well beyond the immediate Buffalo area. 2 of his nephews, both ordained priests, presided over the religious ceremony, adding a layer of legitimacy to proceedings that were being closely monitored by federal authorities. With Don Stefano's death, the question of succession became paramount for both family members and law enforcement agencies seeking to understand the organization's future direction. The National Commission, that governing body of American organized crime families, moved quickly to address the leadership vacuum in Buffalo. Their decision to formally recognize Joseph Frangiamore as the new boss represented an attempt to maintain stability in what had become an increasingly volatile situation. Frangiamore's elevation to full boss status carried with it the explicit expectation that he would restore order to the Buffalo organization and ensure that tribute payments to other families continued without interruption. The Commission's primary concern was maintaining the financial arrangements that had been established during Magaddino's long tenure, while preventing the kind of internal warfare that could attract unwanted attention from federal investigators. As 1974 drew to a close, the Buffalo crime family found itself at a crossroads that would determine its survival in an era of increased law enforcement pressure and changing social conditions. The deaths of both Camilleri and Magaddino had removed two significant figures whose combined influence had helped shape the organization's character for decades. The challenge facing Frangiamore and his associates was whether they could adapt to new realities while maintaining the essential elements that had made their organization successful in the past. Chapter 8. The Pieri-Frangiamore. Years 1974 to 1984. As the 1970s dawned over western New York, the Buffalo crime family found itself entering a period of careful restructuring under the steady guidance of Salvatore Sam Pieri and Joseph Frangiamore. The violent upheavals of the Magaddino succession had finally settled into a more measured rhythm, one that would define the organization for the next decade. This era would be marked not by dramatic power plays or headline-grabbing incidents, but by the quiet efficiency of seasoned administrators rebuilding their family's foundation. Following Joseph Frangiamore's formal installation as boss in 1974, the family implemented a geographic division of responsibilities that reflected both practical necessities and the aging leadership's preferences. Sam Pieri, now serving as underboss, maintained direct oversight of Buffalo proper, the city's established neighborhoods where the family's roots ran deepest. His intimate knowledge of the streets, from the West Side's Italian enclaves to the industrial waterfront, made him the natural choice for this crucial role. Frangiamore himself assumed a different focus, one that acknowledged the changing nature of their operations. His primary attention turned northward to Niagara County and the increasingly important Canadian border. The proximity to Ontario had always presented unique opportunities, but the 1970s brought new possibilities as cross-border commerce expanded. Frangiamore's diplomatic temperament and his established relationships with associates across the Niagara River made him ideally suited for this delicate liaison work. This division of territories allowed both men to play to their strengths, while ensuring comprehensive coverage of the family's interests. Pieri could focus on the day-to-day operations that kept the organization running smoothly, while Frangiamore could cultivate the broader relationships that might prove valuable in an uncertain future. Under this new structure, the family's core revenue streams continued to flow with reassuring consistency. Joseph Pieri Sr., Sam's nephew and a respected capo in his own right, maintained his sophisticated bookmaking operations throughout the Buffalo metropolitan area. His methodical approach to managing betting lines and his careful cultivation of both customers and protection had made his crew one of the family's most reliable sources of income. Working alongside Pieri Sr. was Daniel Sansasane, another capo whose operations had weathered the turbulent transition years remarkably well. Sansasane's territory encompassed several of Buffalo's changing neighborhoods, areas where demographic shifts required careful adaptation of traditional methods. His ability to maintain profitable operations while navigating these social changes demonstrated the kind of flexibility that kept the family relevant. Sam Salento, the third member of this triumvirate of successful capos, brought his own particular expertise to the family's enterprises. His bookmaking operations extended beyond the city limits into the surrounding suburbs, where a growing middle class provided a steady stream of customers for sports betting and numbers games. Silento's careful attention to customer service and his reputation for fair dealings had built a loyal clientele that generated consistent profits year after year. While Buffalo's own operations proceeded with relative calm during this period, events to the east in Rochester would test the family's diplomatic skills and strategic thinking. Between 1971 and 1978, Rochester's criminal landscape erupted in what became known as the Alphabet Wars, a series of conflicts between factions labeled the A-Team and B-Team that would ultimately reshape organized crime in upstate New York. The violence in Rochester presented Buffalo with a delicate challenge. As the senior family in the region, Buffalo held nominal authority over Rochester's criminal activities, yet direct intervention carried significant risks. The bombings and shootings that characterized the Alphabet Wars attracted intense law enforcement attention, precisely the kind of scrutiny that Buffalo's leadership had worked so carefully to avoid. Frangiamore and Pieri chose a path of cautious engagement. When approached by various Rochester factions seeking support or mediation, Buffalo provided neutral arbitrators who could help resolve specific disputes without taking sides in the larger conflict. This approach allowed the family to maintain its traditional role as regional elder while avoiding direct association with the violence that was consuming Rochester's streets. The wisdom of this measured response became clear when the FBI launched Operation Cold Feet, a comprehensive investigation that ultimately decimated Rochester's leadership through federal indictments. As the dust settled in the late 1970s, Buffalo found itself once again exercising practical oversight to Rochester's diminished operations, but without the legal entanglements that might have resulted from more aggressive involvement. During these same years, a figure was quietly rising within the Buffalo organization who would come to define its future direction. Joseph Lead Pipe Joe Todaro Sr. had built his reputation through a combination of union influence and legitimate business success that exemplified the evolving nature of organized crime in the modern era. Todaro's position as a steward in Local 2000 provided him with significant leverage in Buffalo's construction and industrial sectors. His ability to influence work stoppages, hiring decisions, and project timelines gave him a form of power that was both valuable to the family and difficult for law enforcement to prosecute. Unlike the more obvious criminal enterprises of earlier generations, Todaro's union activities operated in the gray areas where legitimate labor organizing intersected with more questionable influence. Peddling. Complementing his union activities was Todaro's ownership of La Nova Pizzeria, a business that would become synonymous with his name throughout Western New York. The restaurant provided more than just a legitimate source of income. It served as a cash pipeline that could launder proceeds from less legal activities while establishing Todaro as a respected figure in Buffalo's business community. The success of La Nova also demonstrated Todaro's understanding of changing times. Rather than relying solely on traditional criminal enterprises, he was building a foundation that could support the family's activities while providing genuine value to the community. The restaurant's growing popularity among Buffalo residents created a buffer of legitimate success that would prove invaluable in the years to come. Perhaps most significantly for the family's long-term prospects, Todaro Sr. was quietly positioning his son, Joseph Big Joe Todaro Jr., for eventual membership in the organization. The younger Todaro had grown up understanding both the opportunities and responsibilities that came with his father's position, and by the early 1980s he was demonstrating the qualities that made him a natural candidate for formal induction. When Todaro Sr. approached Frangiamore about sponsoring his son's entry into the family, the boss's approval reflected both personal trust and strategic thinking. The younger Todaro represented exactly the kind of member the family would need in the coming decades: educated, business-minded, and capable of operating effectively in both legitimate and illegitimate spheres. The induction of Joseph Todaro Jr. as a soldier in the early 1980s marked more than just another ceremony. It represented the family's commitment to evolution and adaptation, bringing in members who could navigate an increasingly complex world where traditional criminal methods had to coexist with sophisticated business practices and heightened law enforcement scrutiny. As 1984 approached, the accumulated weight of years and the stress of leadership began to take their toll on Joseph Frangiamore. His decade at the helm of the Buffalo family had been marked by stability and steady progress, but the boss was increasingly feeling the effects of age and health concerns that made the demanding responsibilities of leadership more difficult to bear. Frangiamore's decision to step down was handled with the same careful diplomacy that had characterized his entire tenure. Rather than creating uncertainty through a dramatic announcement, he began gradually transferring more responsibilities to trusted subordinates while maintaining the relationships necessary for a smooth transition. When the Commission formally acknowledged Joseph Todaro Sr. as the new boss of the Buffalo family in 1984, it marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Frangiamore's retirement was accepted with the respect due to a leader who had successfully guided his organization through a challenging period, while Todaro's elevation reflected confidence in his ability to continue that steady progress. The transition represented more than just a change in leadership. It symbolized the Buffalo family's successful adaptation to the realities of modern organized crime, where success increasingly depended on the ability to balance traditional methods with contemporary business practices and legal constraints. Chapter 9, Todaro Era and Union Dominion, 1985 to 1996. As the 1980s drew to a close, the Buffalo crime family had evolved into something their predecessors could scarcely have imagined. Under the steady guidance of Joseph Todaro Sr., the organization had transformed from a collection of neighborhood crews into a sophisticated enterprise with tentacles reaching across multiple industries. The family's crown jewel remained their control of Local 210, the Laborers' International Union, which had become far more than a simple labor organization. It was their primary source of both power and revenue. The morning sun would rise over Buffalo's construction sites to find a well-oiled machine in operation. Every concrete pour, every foundation dig, every major building project in western New York operated under an unspoken understanding. Contractors who wished to avoid labor disputes, work stoppages, or mysterious equipment failures knew exactly what was expected of them. The arrangement was simple, elegant, and extraordinarily profitable. A labor peace fee, $5 per man-hour for every worker on union jobs. To the casual observer, this might have appeared to be a standard union assessment. In reality, it represented one of the most systematic revenue streams any American crime family had ever established. A modest office building requiring 200 laborers working for 6 months would generate over $100,000 in fees alone. The larger projects, shopping centers, apartment complexes, municipal buildings produced proportionally more. The beauty of this system lay not just in its scope, but in its legitimacy. The payments flowed through proper channels, were documented in union records, and appeared entirely legal to anyone not privy to where those funds ultimately traveled. Joseph Todaro Sr. had learned well from the mistakes of more flamboyant crime bosses. The key to longevity was not the dramatic score, but the steady, reliable income that drew little attention from law enforcement. These funds didn't simply disappear into personal accounts. The Todaro organization had developed a sophisticated method of laundering their union revenues through seemingly legitimate investments. The Local 2010 pension fund, swollen with contributions from thousands of hard-working laborers, began making strategic investments in various enterprises throughout the region. One of the most significant of these investments was Frontier Catering, a company that had somehow managed to secure lucrative contracts for providing food services at numerous union events, construction site canteens, and related functions. What made Frontier Catering particularly interesting was its ownership structure. While publicly held by apparently legitimate businessmen, the company's true controllers were deeply connected to the Todaro family's interests. The pension fund's investment in Frontier generated steady dividend payments that flowed back to the union's coffers, and from there, through carefully managed channels, to the family's leadership. It was a closed loop of remarkable efficiency, generating clean money from what had begun as illicit fees. The federal government, however, was beginning to take notice of these arrangements. In 1989, FBI Special Agent Dean Naum compiled what would become one of the most comprehensive intelligence documents ever assembled about the Buffalo crime family. Working from years of surveillance, wiretaps, and informant reports, Agent Naum created a detailed organizational chart that mapped out the family's complete structure. The Naum affidavit identified 45 made members of the Buffalo family, a number that surprised even seasoned investigators. For decades, law enforcement had underestimated the size and scope of the organization, viewing it as a minor regional player compared to the more famous families of New York City or Chicago. Naum's research revealed a different reality entirely. At the top of this organization sat Joseph Todaro Sr., now in his 60s but still maintaining firm control over all major family decisions. Directly beneath him was his son, Joseph Todaro Jr., who'd assumed the role of acting boss for day-to-day operations. The consigliere position was held by Leonard Falzone, a veteran member whose counsel was valued by both father and son. This triumvirate represented continuity and stability, 3 generations of experience guiding the family's activities. Agent Naum's assessment was stark and comprehensive. In his sealed filing, he wrote, "This family controls gambling, union racketeering, narcotics, and extortion throughout western New York." The document detailed how the Todaros had successfully diversified their criminal portfolio while maintaining their traditional revenue streams. They weren't simply a labor union racket. They were a full-service criminal organization serving the greater Buffalo metropolitan area. The gambling operations alone represented a significant enterprise. The family controlled numerous card games, sports betting operations, and numbers running throughout the city. These weren't small-time neighborhood operations, but sophisticated businesses that processed hundreds of thousands of dollars in wagers annually. The protection and coordination required for such activities demanded the kind of organizational structure that only a mature crime family could provide. While the Naum affidavit was initially sealed, portions of it would eventually leak to the Buffalo News, providing the public with their first detailed glimpse into the scope of local organized crime activities. The revelations sent shockwaves through the community, particularly among union members who had believed their pension contributions were being managed solely for their benefit. During this same period, the family was expanding its narcotics operations through carefully managed partnerships with suppliers from other regions. One of the most significant of these arrangements involved Dominic Torina, a Las Vegas pit boss who had developed reliable smuggling routes from Nevada to Buffalo. Torina's position at a major casino provided him with both the cover and the connections necessary to move substantial quantities of cocaine across state lines. The Torina operation was managed locally by Robert Bobby Panaro and other family associates who specialized in drug distribution. Their network was sophisticated enough to handle multi-kilogram shipments while maintaining the security necessary to avoid law enforcement detection. DEA estimates suggested that this single pipeline was generating over $2 million in annual street sales, with the family share representing a substantial addition to their overall revenue. Paranoia himself was emerging as one of the family's most capable earners and organizers. His ability to manage complex operations while maintaining the low profile that the Todaros demanded made him invaluable to the organization's continued success. Unlike the stereotypical image of the flashy gangster, Paranoia understood that discretion and professionalism were far more valuable than notoriety. The family's reach was extending far beyond Buffalo's city limits. Their connections with other crime families had grown stronger over the years, creating opportunities for joint ventures and mutual support. One such relationship had developed with elements of the Los Angeles crime family, opening possibilities for expansion into new territories and criminal enterprises. These Western connections would eventually lead to discussions about opportunities in Las Vegas, where the family's existing relationship with Dominic Torina had provided valuable intelligence about local criminal activities. Of particular interest was the loan sharking territory controlled by Herbert "Fat Herbie" Blitzstein, a longtime Las Vegas operator who had built a substantial book serving the city's gambling community. The planning for potential Las Vegas operations involved careful coordination between multiple crime families, with meetings held in Tampa to discuss territorial arrangements and profit-sharing agreements. These discussions, conducted with the kind of care typically reserved for legitimate business ventures, demonstrated the sophisticated level of cooperation that had developed between geographically distant criminal organizations. However, the family's period of steady growth and expansion was about to encounter its most serious challenge. The federal government had been watching the deterioration of union integrity across multiple industries, and the Department of Justice was preparing to take unprecedented action against corrupt labor organizations. In 1995, the DOJ filed a comprehensive civil RICO lawsuit targeting the Laborers' International Union of North America, the parent organization of Local 210. The lawsuit alleged a pattern of racketeering activity that had corrupted the union at multiple levels, from local leadership to international officers. The government's goal was not simply to prosecute individual criminals, but to remove organized crime's influence from the union entirely. The impact on the Buffalo family was immediate and devastating. 17 mob-connected officers, including Joseph Todaro Jr., Leonard Falsone, and the Pieri brothers, were barred from any involvement in union activities. A federal trustee was appointed to oversee Local 210's operations, with broad powers to investigate finances, restructure leadership, and implement new oversight procedures. The trusteeship would last for over a decade, from 1995 to 2006, representing the longest period in the family's history without access to their primary revenue source. The $5 per hour fees stopped flowing. The pension fund investments were scrutinized and, in many cases, unwound. The carefully constructed financial pipeline that had sustained the organization for years was effectively shut down overnight. For Joseph Todaro Sr., now in his 70s, the federal intervention represented both a personal and organizational crisis. The union control that he had inherited, expanded, and refined over decades of careful management was suddenly beyond his reach. The family would need to adapt quickly or face the prospect of gradual dissolution as their primary income source disappeared. The younger generation of family members found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Unlike their predecessors who had built the organization during Prohibition or expanded it during the post-war boom, they would need to navigate a modern law enforcement environment that was far more sophisticated and aggressive than anything the family had previously encountered. As 1996 drew to a close, the Buffalo crime family stood at a crossroads. Their traditional power base was under federal control, their leadership was facing constant surveillance, and their revenue streams were being systematically dismantled. Yet the organization that Joseph Todaro Sr. had built was more resilient than its enemies might have hoped. The true test of their adaptability was only beginning. Chapter 10, 1997-2005. The late 1990s brought seismic changes to the Buffalo crime family's Canadian operations, fundamentally altering relationships that had endured for nearly half a century. What had been a carefully maintained network of tribute and control across the Niagara Peninsula would be shattered by violence, cooperation with law enforcement, and the rise of new criminal alliances that challenged Buffalo's traditional authority in Ontario. On the morning of May 31, 1997, 73-year-old Johnny Pops Paperleer followed his usual routine, parking his Cadillac outside the Galaxy Vending Company on Railway Street in Hamilton's industrial district. For decades, this modest storefront had served as the nerve center of his operations, where tribute flowed from across the Golden Horseshoe, and decisions were made that affected criminal enterprises from Toronto to Buffalo. Papalia had built his reputation through careful cultivation of fear and respect, maintaining order in Hamilton's underworld while ensuring that Buffalo's interests remained paramount. His relationship with the Magaddino family, and later the Todaro regime, had provided him with the backing necessary to control Ontario's most lucrative criminal territories. Local bookmakers, loan sharks, and legitimate businessmen all understood that Papalia's word carried the weight of Buffalo's authority. That morning, as Papalia stepped from his vehicle, he was joined by Carmen Barillaro, his trusted lieutenant and longtime companion in the family's Canadian operations. Barillaro, at 63, had served as Papalia's enforcer and business partner for over 2 decades, helping to maintain the delicate balance of relationships that kept Hamilton's criminal economy functioning smoothly. Neither man noticed the figure approaching from across the street. Kenneth Murdoch, a 27-year-old local criminal with mounting gambling debts, had been recruited for what would become one of the most significant assassinations in Canadian organized crime history. The contract, worth $2,000, represented more than just the elimination of 2 aging criminals. It was a declaration of independence that would reverberate across the border into Buffalo. The shots came without warning, ending both men's lives instantly on the sidewalk outside the building where they had conducted business for so many years. Papalia's death marked the end of an era, removing Buffalo's primary enforcer in Ontario and creating a power vacuum that ambitious local criminals were eager to fill. The assassination had been orchestrated by Pat and Angelo Musitano, brothers who had grown tired of paying tribute to Buffalo through Papalia's network. Their family had operated in Hamilton for generations, but always under the shadow of Papalia's authority and Buffalo's ultimate control. The brothers saw an opportunity to eliminate the middleman and establish direct control over Hamilton's criminal enterprises. Pat Musitano, the elder brother at 35, had been building relationships with local crews and establishing his own network of contacts in the drug trade. Angelo, 3 years younger, provided the muscle and street credibility necessary to challenge established authority. Together, they represented a new generation of Canadian criminals who viewed the traditional cross-border hierarchy as an outdated relic. The brothers' calculation was simple: remove Papalia and Barillaro, and Buffalo's ability to enforce tribute collection would be severely compromised. They understood that the American family lacked the local knowledge and connections necessary to immediately replace their longtime representatives. This created a window of opportunity to consolidate power and present Buffalo with a fait accompli. However, the Musitanos had underestimated the investigative capabilities of Canadian law enforcement and the willingness of their hired killer to cooperate with authorities when facing serious charges. Kenneth Murdoch's arrest came swiftly as Hamilton Police and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had been monitoring organized crime activities in the region for months. The brazen nature of the Papalia assassination, conducted in broad daylight on a busy street, had shocked both law enforcement and the criminal community. The investigation that followed would expose the conspiracy behind the murders and provide unprecedented insight into the changing dynamics of organized crime in Ontario. By 1999, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of life imprisonment, Murdoch made the decision that would seal the fate of his employers. His cooperation with Crown prosecutors provided detailed testimony about the planning and execution of the assassinations, including the Musitano brothers' motivations and their desire to break free from Buffalo's control. The brothers, recognizing that their situation had become untenable, entered into plea negotiations with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty to conspiracy charges rather than facing first-degree murder trials, Pat and Angelo Musitano received 10-year sentences. The plea agreement effectively confirmed what investigators had suspected, that the murders were part of a calculated attempt to restructure organized crime relationships in the Hamilton area. Their incarceration, with release scheduled for 2007, removed the immediate threat they posed to Buffalo's interests, but also created new challenges for the American family's Canadian operations. The power vacuum created by the Papalia murders and the Musitano arrests opened opportunities for other criminal organizations to establish footholds in Ontario. The Violi Lupino crew, traditional rivals of the Papalia faction, moved quickly to fill the void, but they understood that their success would depend on forming new alliances with groups that could provide the muscle and logistical support they lacked. The Hells Angels, Niagara chapter, emerged as the most significant new player in this reorganized criminal landscape. The motorcycle club had been expanding its operations throughout Ontario, establishing drug trafficking networks and building relationships with established organized crime figures. Their alliance with the Violi Lupino crew represented a fundamental shift in how criminal enterprises would be structured in the post-Papalia era. This partnership provided mutual benefits for both organizations. The Violi Lupino crew brought decades of experience in traditional organized crime activities, established relationships with corrupt officials, and knowledge of local criminal opportunities. The Hells Angels contributed a disciplined organizational structure, extensive drug trafficking networks, and a reputation for violence that served as an effective deterrent to potential rivals. The cocaine trade became the primary focus of this new alliance, with the bikers providing both supply connections and distribution networks that extended far beyond Hamilton's traditional boundaries. Their operations encompassed not only the Golden Horseshoe but also trafficking routes that connected Montreal suppliers with American markets, creating revenue streams that dwarfed the traditional tribute payments that had flowed to Buffalo. By 1999, Canadian intelligence agencies were documenting significant changes in organized crime structures throughout Ontario. The Criminal Intelligence Service Canada issued reports identifying what they termed a new lord aligned with Buffalo, who appeared to be consolidating control over the Niagara-Hamilton corridor. While they declined to name specific individuals, RCMP sources suggested that the Todaro faction in Buffalo was attempting to rebuild its Canadian network through different intermediaries. These intelligence assessments painted a picture of an evolving criminal landscape where traditional hierarchies were being challenged by more flexible, partnership-based arrangements. The old model of clear territorial control and tribute payments was giving way to more complex relationships that emphasized mutual profit rather than simple subordination. The reports also highlighted the increasing sophistication of drug trafficking operations, noting that Canadian organizations were no longer content to serve merely as conduits for American criminal enterprises. Instead, they were developing independent capabilities and establishing direct relationships with international suppliers, reducing their dependence on cross-border partnerships. The loss of their primary Canadian revenue stream forced the Buffalo family to fundamentally reassess their operations and develop new sources of income. The tribute payments that had provided steady cash flow for decades were no longer reliable, and attempts to establish new collection networks faced resistance from increasingly independent Canadian criminals. Joseph Todaro Jr. and his associates recognized that their family's future success would depend on adapting to these changed circumstances rather than attempting to recreate past arrangements. The days when Buffalo could simply install a representative like Papalia and expect tribute to flow automatically were clearly over. The family's response involved diversifying into criminal enterprises that were less dependent on territorial control and physical presence. Sports betting operations expanded significantly, taking advantage of growing American interest in professional and collegiate athletics. These operations utilized sophisticated phone rooms and offshore connections that generated substantial profits while requiring minimal infrastructure within Canadian territory. Offshore gambling operations became another significant revenue source, with Buffalo serving as an intermediary between Canadian technical expertise and American customer bases. These ventures operated in legal gray areas that made prosecution difficult, while generating profits that rival traditional organized crime activities. Perhaps most importantly, Buffalo began developing its role as a broker between various criminal organizations, rather than attempting to control territory directly. The family's long-established relationships with both Canadian and American criminals positioned them uniquely to facilitate large-scale drug transactions, money laundering operations, and other criminal enterprises that required trusted intermediaries. By 2005, the criminal landscape of the Niagara Peninsula bore little resemblance to the carefully structured hierarchy that had existed under Papalia's control. Multiple organizations now operated with varying degrees of independence, forming temporary alliances for specific ventures while maintaining their own territorial and operational autonomy. The Hells Angels had emerged as perhaps the most powerful single organization in the region, with their disciplined structure and extensive drug trafficking capabilities, providing them with resources that traditional organized crime families struggled to match. Their alliance with local crews had proven more durable and profitable than the old tribute-based relationships. Buffalo's role had evolved from that of a controlling authority to that of a specialized service provider, offering expertise in areas where their decades of experience provided competitive advantages. While this represented a significant reduction in their direct control over Canadian territory, it also provided opportunities for profit that were less dependent on violence and territorial disputes. The changes that began with the Papalia assassination had fundamentally altered the balance of power in cross-border organized crime, creating a more complex but potentially more stable arrangement that would define criminal relationships in the region for years to come. The age of simple hierarchies and tribute payments had ended, replaced by a network of partnerships and alliances that reflected the evolving nature of organized crime in North America. As the decade concluded, both law enforcement and criminal organizations were still adapting to these new realities, understanding that the old certainties of territorial control and clear hierarchies had given way to a more fluid and unpredictable criminal landscape that would require new strategies and approaches to navigate successfully. Chapter 11, Withered Arm, Myth and Survival. As the first decade of the new millennium drew to a close, the Buffalo crime family found itself at what many observers believed to be a crossroads between extinction and quiet adaptation. The year 2006 marked a symbolic changing of the guard that would define the family's approach to survival in an increasingly challenging environment for traditional organized crime. In the spring of 2006, Joseph Todaro Sr., now in his late 70s, made the decision that had been anticipated for several years. After decades of leadership through some of the family's most turbulent periods, the aging Don announced his intention to retire to Florida, joining the countless other Northeastern retirees who had made the Sunshine State their final destination. The transition was handled with characteristic discretion. Rather than a dramatic abdication, Todaro Sr.'s departure was presented as a gradual stepping back from day-to-day responsibilities. Leonard Falsone, who had served faithfully as underboss through the tumultuous years of federal investigations and internal restructuring, was quietly elevated to the position of front boss. This arrangement allowed for continuity while providing the appearance of complete separation from the family's past operations. Joseph Todaro Jr., now approaching his 50s, made what appeared to be an even more definitive statement. In conversations with associates and family members, he claimed to have achieved full withdrawal from any involvement in the organization that had shaped his family's identity for generations. To outside observers, this declaration seemed to represent the final chapter in the Todaro dynasty's control over Buffalo's underworld. Local newspapers, particularly the Buffalo News, treated these developments as the end of an era. Editorial writers and crime reporters who had covered the family for decades penned retrospective pieces that read like obituaries for organized crime in western New York. The consensus among media observers was clear. the Buffalo crime family, weakened by federal prosecutions and changing social dynamics, was finally succumbing to the forces that had diminished the Cosa Nostra families across the nation. The media's interpretation of the Buffalo family's decline had been significantly influenced by a comprehensive feature article published by Lee Coppola in 1998. This piece, which examined organized crime in Western New York, had introduced the memorable phrase, "withered arm," to describe what the author saw as the family's diminished capacity for traditional criminal enterprises. Coppola's analysis focused on several key factors that he argued had fundamentally undermined the family's operations. The expansion of state-sanctioned gambling, particularly the introduction of the New York State Lottery and the development of nearby Native American casinos, had eliminated much of the demand for illegal numbers, running, and sports betting that had long provided steady income for the organization. Federal law enforcement initiatives, including the successful prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s, had created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and legal jeopardy that made traditional racketeering activities increasingly risky and unprofitable. The article quoted a federal agent who observed that young Italian Americans simply aren't joining these organizations anymore, suggesting that the family faced not just operational challenges but also a fundamental recruitment crisis. This assessment became conventional wisdom among law enforcement analysts and crime journalists. When the Buffalo News published its own comprehensive retrospective in 2017, the newspaper largely echoed Coppola's conclusions, portraying the Buffalo crime family as a relic of an earlier era that had been rendered obsolete by legal gambling, aggressive federal prosecution, and changing cultural attitudes within Italian-American communities. However, federal surveillance and informant reports from the period between 2006 and 2016 revealed a more complex reality than the public narrative suggested. While the Buffalo crime family had indeed adapted its operations and reduced its profile, it had not simply faded into irrelevance as many observers believed. A 2016 FBI debriefing of a long-term informant provided detailed insights into the family's continued activities during this supposedly dormant period. According to this source, the organization maintained several key revenue streams that, while less spectacular than the large-scale operations of previous decades, provided steady income for its membership. The family continued to operate a loan sharking business that charged a traditional 2% weekly interest rate on outstanding balances. This operation, significantly smaller than the extensive lending networks of earlier eras, focused primarily on borrowers within established Italian-American social circles and small business owners who had difficulty obtaining conventional financing. Sports betting remained active, though conducted with considerably more discretion than in previous decades. Rather than operating from fixed locations or maintaining visible booking operations, the family's gambling activities were centered in several North Buffalo bars and social clubs where longtime patrons could place wagers with trusted associates. Perhaps most telling was the family's maintenance of traditional organizational rituals and social structures. The monthly dinner meetings at the Italian Village restaurant on Hertel Avenue served both practical and symbolic purposes. These gatherings allowed leadership to maintain contact with members and associates while reinforcing the cultural bonds that had sustained the organization through decades of external pressure. The informant's 2016 assessment provided specific details about the family's membership structure that challenged assumptions about its decline. The organization maintained approximately 30 made members, a number that represented a significant reduction from peak periods but indicated a stable core group rather than a collapsing institution. The average age of family members was approximately 60 years, reflecting both the organization's aging leadership and the reduced recruitment that federal agents had noted in previous assessments. However, this demographic challenge had been partially addressed through an unexpected source: Canadian connections. The family's historical ties to organized crime figures in southern Ontario had evolved into a recruitment pipeline that helped maintain membership levels. Several recent inductees have been drawn from Italian-Canadian criminal networks, bringing both fresh blood and cross-border connections that enhance the organization's operational flexibility. These new members typically possess skills and connections that complemented the family's adapted operational approach. Rather than the street-level enforcers and numbers runners of earlier generations, recent recruits often had experience in legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for criminal activities or provide opportunities for more sophisticated financial crimes. The Buffalo crime family's approach to survival during this period represented a careful balance between maintaining organizational identity and adapting to changed circumstances. Leadership recognized that the high-profile activities that had characterized earlier decades were no longer sustainable in the current law enforcement environment. Instead of abandoning criminal activity entirely, the family adopted what might be described as a minimalist approach. Operations were scaled down, conducted with extreme discretion, and limited to activities that carried relatively low risks of federal intervention. The emphasis shifted from territorial control and large-scale racketeering to more personal, relationship-based criminal enterprises. This strategy required significant changes in organizational culture. The flashy displays of wealth and power that had marked previous eras gave way to deliberate inconspicuousness. Members were encouraged to maintain legitimate employment and avoid behaviors that might attract law enforcement attention. The family's adaptation strategy also included a sophisticated understanding of media perception and public relations. By allowing narratives of decline and dissolution to circulate unchallenged, leadership created a protective environment where reduced expectations from law enforcement and journalists provided operational space for continued activities. As 2016 drew to a close, the Buffalo crime family had successfully navigated a decade of supposed retirement and dissolution while maintaining the essential elements of its organizational structure. The withered arm that observers had declared dead was perhaps better described as deliberately withdrawn, waiting for circumstances that might allow for renewed extension into the criminal marketplace. The challenge facing the organization as it moved toward its second century of existence was whether this cautious survival strategy could sustain the family through another generation of social and legal change, or whether the forces that had diminished La Cosa Nostra families across America would ultimately prove insurmountable, even for an organization as adaptable as Buffalo's enduring crime family. Chapter 12. Modern Reveal. Project Otremen. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn across the Niagara region in October 2017, marking not just another seasonal change, but the beginning of the end for decades of carefully guarded secrets within the Buffalo crime family. What would unfold over the following months would provide law enforcement with the most comprehensive glimpse into the family's modern operations since the Magaddino wiretaps of the 1960s. Project Otremen began quietly, as most successful investigations do. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had been monitoring suspicious activities along the Hamilton-Buffalo corridor for months, watching patterns of movement and communication that suggested something significant was happening within the region's organized crime networks. The focus gradually narrowed to two young men whose family names carried considerable weight in certain circles: Domenico and Giuseppe Violi, grandsons of the late Giacomo Lupino. The Violi brothers represented a new generation within families that had maintained their influence for over half a century. Their grandfather, Giacomo, had been a respected figure in Hamilton's Italian-Canadian community, a man whose legitimate businesses had provided stability for his family while maintaining connections that stretched across the border into western New York. Now, his grandsons found themselves carrying forward traditions and relationships that had been carefully cultivated over decades. The RCMP's approach was methodical and patient. Rather than moving quickly on initial suspicions, investigators took time to understand the broader network they were observing. This patience would prove crucial as the investigation gradually revealed connections that extended far beyond simple drug trafficking into the heart of organized crime's most enduring institution, the Commission itself. An undercover officer, known in court documents only as Operative B, began establishing contact with the Violi brothers in the summer of 2017. The officer presented himself as a potential buyer interested in purchasing significant quantities of narcotics, specifically fentanyl and MDMA. These substances represented the modern evolution of organized crime's involvement in drug trafficking, moving far beyond the traditional marijuana and cocaine operations that had sustained many families for decades. The brothers proved receptive to the officer's overtures, and over several months, a relationship of apparent trust developed. Domenico Violi, in particular, seemed comfortable discussing not just immediate business matters, but broader aspects of their family's position within the larger organizational structure. This comfort would ultimately prove to be a critical mistake. On October 21, 2017, Operative B met with Domenico Violi for what appeared to be a routine transaction. Unknown to Violi, sophisticated recording equipment captured every word of their conversation. What emerged from that recording would provide investigators with insights into the Buffalo family's structure and operations that had remained hidden for years. During their conversation, Domenico made a statement that would later prove to be one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. Speaking with apparent pride and confidence, he told the undercover officer, "Todaro made me underboss. First Canadian ever." This simple sentence carried enormous implications, confirming not only the continued existence of formal leadership structures within the Buffalo family, but also the expansion of those structures across international borders. The significance of this claim extended well beyond Domenico's personal position. If accurate, it represented a fundamental shift in how the Buffalo family operated, incorporating Canadian associates and operations into their formal hierarchy in ways that had never been officially acknowledged before. The cross-border nature of this arrangement also suggested a level of sophistication and integration that law enforcement had suspected but never been able to prove. Domenico's statements during the recorded conversation revealed additional details about recent organizational changes within the family. He described how Joseph Todaro Jr. had traveled to Florida for meetings that would determine the legitimacy of these new arrangements. According to Violi, Todaro had made contact with 3 bosses from New York City families, seeking their blessing for the structural changes he was implementing in Buffalo. This revelation provided investigators with crucial intelligence about the continued existence and operation of the Commission, the governing body that had overseen organized crime activities across multiple families since the 1930s. Many law enforcement experts had speculated that the Commission had become largely ceremonial or had ceased to function entirely following decades of prosecutions and leadership disruptions. Violi's casual reference to seeking Commission approval suggested otherwise. The Florida meetings that Violi described represented a continuation of traditions that stretched back to the earliest days of organized crime in America. The practice of seeking approval from established families for significant organizational changes had been a cornerstone of La Cosa Nostra operations for nearly a century. That these protocols were still being followed in 2017 indicated a level of institutional continuity that many observers had thought no longer existed. As the investigation continued through the fall of 2017, RCMP officers gathered additional evidence of the scope and scale of the operation they were monitoring. The Violi brothers were not operating as independent drug dealers, but rather as part of a sophisticated network that connected Canadian suppliers with American distributors through established organized crime channels. The culmination of Project Otremen came on November 9, 2017, when coordinated raids took place simultaneously across Hamilton, Toronto, and Buffalo. The operation represented unprecedented cooperation between Canadian and American law enforcement agencies, reflecting the international scope of the organization they were targeting. The seizures from these raids painted a picture of substantial criminal enterprise. Officers recovered approximately 260,000 pills of various narcotics, along with weapons and 35,000 in cash. The scale of these recoveries suggested operations that generated significant revenue and required careful coordination across multiple locations and jurisdictions. Perhaps more importantly than the physical evidence, the investigation provided law enforcement with detailed intelligence about the Buffalo family's current structure and membership. Through various sources and methods, investigators were able to confirm the existence of approximately 30 made members within the organization, a number that surprised many experts who had assumed the family's membership had declined significantly over recent decades. The legal proceedings that followed the November raids unfolded over the subsequent year. Domenico Violi ultimately entered a guilty plea in December 2018, accepting responsibility for his role in the drug trafficking operation. The 8-year sentence he received reflected both the seriousness of the charges and his cooperation with authorities in providing additional information about the organization's structure and operations. The transcripts and evidence that emerged from Project Otremen provided the most comprehensive view of the Buffalo family's modern operations since the extensive surveillance operations of the 1960s. The investigation confirmed that despite decades of law enforcement pressure and generational changes in leadership, the family had maintained its organizational structure and continued to operate according to traditional protocols and hierarchies. The revelation that the Commission continued to function and exercise authority over family operations represented perhaps the most significant intelligence development in organized crime investigations in years. The fact that Joseph Todaro Jr. had sought and apparently received Commission approval for his organizational changes suggested that these traditional power structures retained real influence and authority. As the autumn of 2018 approached and the legal proceedings concluded, law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border found themselves with a clearer picture of organized crime's continued presence in the Niagara region. Project Otremen had pulled back the curtain on operations that had remained hidden for decades, revealing an organization that had successfully adapted to modern challenges while maintaining its essential character and traditions. The investigation marked not an ending, but rather a new chapter in the ongoing story of the Buffalo crime family, an organization that had proven remarkably resilient across nearly a century of challenges and changes. Chapter 13, Ontario Mob, War and Present Snapshot. As the spring of 2017 arrived in the Hamilton area, the old tensions that had simmered beneath the surface for decades were about to explode into violence that would reshape the criminal landscape of southern Ontario. The Musitano family, once proud allies of Buffalo's Magaddino organization, found themselves isolated and vulnerable in a changing underworld. On the evening of May 9, 2017, Angelo Musitano pulled his vehicle into the familiar driveway of his watered-down home. The 69-year-old had spent the day attending to business matters, likely unaware that his movements had been carefully observed. As he stepped from his car, gunshots shattered the quiet suburban evening. Angelo, the younger brother of the late Dominic Musitano, collapsed in his own driveway, another casualty in a war that had its roots in events from decades past. The assassination of Angelo Musitano sent immediate ripples through both law enforcement and criminal circles. This was not a random act of violence, but rather a calculated strike that bore all the hallmarks of organized crime retribution. Angelo had been a respected figure in Hamilton's Italian-Canadian community, a man who had maintained connections to both legitimate business interests and the shadowy world his family had inhabited for generations. The violence did not end with Angelo's death. On September 13, 2018, Al Iavarone, a man with known connections to the Musitano organization, was gunned down in his Hamilton driveway. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone was systematically eliminating members of the Musitano network. Each killing was carried out with professional precision, suggesting the involvement of experienced operators rather than street-level criminals. Pat Musitano, Angelo's nephew and the surviving leader of the family organization, found himself living under constant threat. In April 2009, gunmen attempted to kill him in a Mississauga parking lot, but Pat survived the attack, though wounded. For over a year, he lived with the knowledge that his enemies were patient and persistent. On July 10, 2020, Pat Musitano's luck finally ran out. As he left a Montana's restaurant in Burlington, Ontario, assassins were waiting in the parking lot. The gunshots that ended Pat's life also marked the effective end of the Musitano family as a force in organized crime. The Montana's location was particularly symbolic, a public restaurant where families gathered, now forever associated with the violent conclusion of a criminal dynasty. Law enforcement officials quietly acknowledged that the systematic elimination of the Musitano organization appeared to represent the completion of a revenge cycle that had been decades in the making. The methodical nature of the killings suggested coordination and resources that pointed to involvement by more established criminal organizations, possibly including elements connected to the Buffalo family. While violence played out on Canadian soil, American law enforcement was uncovering a web of corruption that illustrated the ongoing connections between Buffalo's criminal organization and cross-border activities. In 2019, federal prosecutors indicted former DEA agent Joseph Bongiovanni on charges that painted a disturbing picture of law enforcement corruption. The allegations against Bongiovanni were particularly serious because they involved a sworn law enforcement officer using his position to protect criminal enterprises. Prosecutors alleged that he had received cash payments and other benefits in exchange for shielding drug networks connected to Buffalo criminal interests. The case demonstrated how organized crime's influence could reach into the very institutions designed to combat it. The corruption investigation expanded to include Peter Grace Jr., whose family connections to the Todaro organization made his case particularly significant. Grace operated establishments in the Niagara Falls area, a location that had long been important to Buffalo crime family operations due to its proximity to the Canadian border. In December 2024, Grace was convicted on multiple charges, including maintaining drug premises, bribery, and trafficking offenses. The Grace conviction was notable not just for the crimes themselves, but for what it revealed about the ongoing operations of the Buffalo organization. Despite decades of law enforcement pressure and the aging of its leadership, the family maintained the ability to cultivate corrupt relationships and operate sophisticated criminal enterprises across international borders. As of 2025, the Buffalo crime family continues to operate under a traditional structure, though adapted to contemporary realities. Joseph Big Joe Todaro Jr., now 77 years old, remains the recognized boss of the organization. However, those familiar with the family's operations suggest that Todaro has adopted a semi-retired status, involving himself primarily in major decisions while delegating day-to-day operations to trusted subordinates. The underboss position is reportedly held by Robert Bobby Panaro, a man in his late 60s who has developed particular expertise in coordinating the family's Las Vegas connections. Panaro's role reflects the modern reality of organized crime, where geographic boundaries matter less than maintaining profitable relationships across multiple jurisdictions. Victor Vic Sansasane, at 74 years old, serves as the organization's consigliere, providing counsel and helping to resolve internal disputes. Sansasane's longevity in this role speaks to his skill in navigating the complex personal and business relationships that define organized crime families. The operational structure includes several active capos who oversee different geographic territories and criminal enterprises. The Pieri crew maintains influence in North Buffalo, focusing on traditional neighborhood-based activities. The Lupino Violi crew operates primarily in the Hamilton, Ontario area, maintaining the family's Canadian connections despite the recent violence that eliminated the Musitano organization. The Panepinto crew oversees activities in the Niagara Falls corridor, taking advantage of the border location for various criminal enterprises. The Buffalo family's current criminal activities reflect both traditional organized crime methods and adaptation to contemporary opportunities. Sports betting has become a significant focus, particularly with the expansion of legal gambling in New York State. However, the family has found ways to operate parallel illegal operations that offer better odds for certain customers and avoid the taxation and reporting requirements of legitimate establishments. These betting operations utilize sophisticated technology, including offshore servers located in Costa Rica that mirror legitimate sports betting applications. Customers can place bets through what appear to be legal platforms, but settlements are handled through cash transactions at Buffalo area bars and restaurants. This system allows the organization to capture profits from gambling while maintaining distance from the actual transactions. Drug trafficking continues to represent a major source of revenue for the organization. Current operations focus heavily on cocaine importation from South American sources, with the drugs moved across the Canadian border using legitimate commercial vehicles. Produced trucks have proven particularly effective for this purpose, as their regular cross-border movements and perishable cargo discourage thorough inspections by customs officials. The family has also adapted traditional loan sharking operations to target modern businesses. Restaurant owners, who often face cash flow challenges and have difficulty obtaining traditional bank loans, have become primary targets for high-interest lending schemes. These loans are marketed as salary advance programs, but carry interest rates of approximately 2% per week, creating debt traps that ensure long-term control over borrowers. To most Buffalo residents, the Mafia represents a relic from the city's industrial past, a colorful part of local history rather than a contemporary concern. The decline of Buffalo's steel industry and the general economic challenges facing the region have made organized crime seem less relevant to daily life. Many residents view the family as a ghost of the steel days, more myth than reality in the modern era. However, law enforcement officials maintain a different perspective on the organization's current relevance. Homicide detectives investigating major crimes in Ontario have quietly noted what they term Buffalo links in virtually every significant organized crime killing since 2017. While these connections may not always be direct, the pattern suggests that Buffalo criminal interests continue to influence events across the border. The challenge for law enforcement lies in the organization's evolution toward more sophisticated and subtle operations. Unlike the highly visible activities of previous decades, current Buffalo family operations are designed to blend into legitimate business activities. This adaptation makes detection more difficult, but also suggests that the organization has learned from past mistakes and developed greater operational security. As the Buffalo crime family enters its second century of existence, it faces the same challenges that confront all traditional organized crime groups: aging leadership, increased law enforcement sophistication, and competition from newer criminal organizations. However, the recent convictions and ongoing investigations suggest that reports of the family's demise have been greatly exaggerated. The organization continues to adapt, evolve, and maintain its position in the complex world of modern organized crime. The story of the Buffalo crime family remains unfinished, its final chapter yet to be written in the ongoing struggle between criminal enterprise and law enforcement in the Great Lakes region. As we reach the twilight of our journey through the Buffalo crime family's century-long story, we find ourselves standing at the edge of shadows that may never fully retreat into light. Like many tales of organized crime, the Magaddino family's history concludes not with dramatic revelations, but with whispered questions that echo through time, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The most persistent of these mysteries centers around Stefano Magaddino's legendary fortune. When federal agents finally gained access to his financial records in the 1970s, they discovered approximately $521,000 in various accounts and properties. A substantial sum, certainly, but one that seemed almost modest for a man who had controlled vast criminal enterprises for nearly half a century. This discovery only deepened the intrigue surrounding the true extent of his wealth. Family associates had long whispered of hidden caches throughout western New York and southern Ontario. Some spoke of safety deposit boxes scattered across banks in Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and Toronto, each containing bundles of cash wrapped in oilcloth. Others suggested more elaborate concealment methods, money buried beneath the concrete floors of legitimate businesses or sealed within the walls of trusted associates' homes during renovations. Perhaps the most intriguing theory involves the old country itself. According to sources within the Sicilian community, Stefano had maintained strong ties to his ancestral village of Castellammare del Golfo throughout his life in America. These connections allegedly included regular shipments of gold coins, American eagles and Italian ducats, sent back to Sicily for safekeeping in the family crypt. The story suggests that generations of Magaddinos had followed this practice, creating a treasure that would be virtually impossible for American authorities to trace or recover. No ledger documenting these transactions has ever been found, despite extensive searches of Magaddino properties and the homes of his closest associates. If such records existed, they likely went to the grave with Stefano himself, leaving behind only speculation and the tantalizing possibility that somewhere substantial wealth remains hidden, waiting for discovery. Equally perplexing is the question of who orchestrated the brutal elimination of the Camilleri faction in the late 1960s. While the murders themselves are well documented, the identity of the mastermind behind this systematic purge remains a subject of debate among crime historians and former law enforcement officials. One theory places responsibility squarely on the shoulders of Salvatore Pieri, Magaddino's ambitious underboss. According to this interpretation, Pieri recognized that the Camilleri brothers represented the most significant threat to his own ascension within the family hierarchy. Their connections to New York families and their growing influence in legitimate businesses made them dangerous rivals for future leadership. By eliminating them while Stefano was still alive but increasingly frail, Pieri could consolidate power without appearing to directly challenge the aging Don. An alternative theory suggests that Peter Magaddino, Stefano's nephew, was the architect of the killings. This interpretation portrays the murders as a preemptive strike against family members who might challenge Peter's eventual inheritance of leadership. The Camilleri brothers' reputation for violence and their independent streak made them unlikely to accept subordination to someone they might view as less experienced or capable. What makes this mystery particularly frustrating for investigators is the complete absence of surviving witnesses or documentary evidence. No indictments were ever issued in connection with the murders, and those who might have possessed knowledge of the planning took their secrets to their graves. The truth remains locked away, another example of the code of silence that protected the family's most sensitive operations. Perhaps the most intriguing unresolved mystery involves allegations of cooperation between the Buffalo crime family and United States intelligence agencies during the Cold War era. Rumors that surfaced in the 1950s suggested that Magaddino's organization had been recruited to assist in monitoring Soviet agents who might attempt to enter the United States through the relatively porous border at Niagara Falls. The theory held a certain logical appeal. The Buffalo family's extensive network of contacts on both sides of the border, combined with their intimate knowledge of smuggling routes and border security weaknesses, would have made them valuable assets for intelligence gathering. Their legitimate businesses, restaurants, import companies, and transportation services provided perfect cover for observing suspicious activities or individuals. According to these accounts, family members were instructed to report unusual behavior among recent immigrants, particularly those with Eastern European backgrounds or connections to diplomatic missions. In exchange, federal authorities allegedly turned a blind eye to certain family operations, allowing them to continue their traditional activities without interference. Freedom of Information Act requests filed by researchers and journalists have so far yielded no documentation supporting these claims. Government agencies continue to maintain that no such arrangements existed, though the absence of records could equally suggest successful operational security or the destruction of sensitive materials. Like so many aspects of intelligence work and organized crime, the truth may remain forever hidden beneath layers of official denial and institutional secrecy. As we consider the family's future, the picture becomes increasingly uncertain. Daniel Panaro, carefully groomed for leadership throughout the 1970s, represented the last generation with direct ties to the family's founding era. His understanding of traditional methods and old-world connections made him a logical choice for succession, yet the world around him was changing rapidly. The Canadian branch of the family, centered around the Violi brothers in Montreal, possessed the organizational strength and territorial control that the Buffalo faction increasingly lacked. Their involvement in narcotics trafficking, while risky, generated revenue streams that dwarfed traditional gambling and loan sharking operations. Some observers suggested that the future of the Magaddino legacy lay not in Buffalo, but in the northern cities where Italian-Canadian communities maintained stronger cultural cohesion. Yet even this possibility seemed doubtful as the 1980s approached. The neighborhood social clubs that had once served as informal headquarters were closing their doors, replaced by chain restaurants and corporate businesses that had no need for the family's traditional services. The bookmakers who had once operated from every corner barbershop found themselves competing with state-sponsored lotteries and legal casinos. The very foundations of organized crime's economic model were shifting beneath their feet. In the end, criminal empires built on whispers and maintained through fear rarely conclude with dramatic explosions or definitive endings. Instead, they tend to fade gradually, like evening shadows lengthening until they merge with darkness. The stories remain passed down through families, recorded in court documents, preserved in newspaper archives. But the power and influence they describe becomes increasingly distant, almost mythical. The Buffalo crime family's century-long journey through American history serves as a reminder that even the most secretive organizations leave traces of their passage. Though many questions remain unanswered, the outline of their story emerges clearly enough. Ambitious immigrants who built vast criminal enterprises, maintained them through violence and corruption, and ultimately watched them diminish as the world transformed around them. Some mysteries may never be solved, but perhaps that is fitting for an organization that prized secrecy above all else. In the gathering dusk of their influence, the Magaddino family's greatest secrets remain exactly where they intended them to be, hidden in shadows, protected by silence, and known only to those who have taken them to their graves.